All right.
Hello and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Mike Buhl. So, welcome,
So,
Mike, to the
yep,
podcast.
yep.
Okay, so we'll start the discussion of today with a blog post that I recently published, and it was titled "Does a high GDP produce a high quality of life?" And so I'm gonna, you
Question.
know,
Good question.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good, fair
I'm
question.
gonna let Mike take the first word, and then I'm gonna discuss like what my points were and stuff.
Yeah. This is a kind of an ambivalent question. A lot of people like to use GDP per capita as a measure of a kind of good life for good outcome. And others think that the GDP measure is inadequate. And so the big question, that people raise, are there other multidimensional measures that we should consider besides just a pure economic measure? You know, I think that's in a nutshell, when I read the post from Larry, other measures that we might need to consider: health, housing, work, leisure time, education, cultural factors, urban life. Uh, I mean, you got a whole list of other possible measures. So just to repeat, there's a real question. If we just focus on economic measures, is that the same thing as a good quality life? You know, and if that's adequate, we just say economic growth will just make everybody happier and everybody have a good sustaining life, a good quality of life, good life expectancy. Or are there other measures we might also consider? Like you, I think you abbreviated it. It was quality of life measure, and you took the definition from. Help me out. Where'd you took the definition from when you defined it
The
for
quality of life. So there was a
the
Kahneman
def?
and Deaton.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, so they had
yeah,
the quality of life was one of the people. And then there's like Bill Easterlin. I mean, there were a few people
yeah.
that do this kind of research. Um, and yeah.
Another thing I wanted to mention also to the listeners, but what I like about this post is there's empirical data and there's graphs that are used. So you can visually follow in comparison, with other countries, let's say life expectancy and health expenditure. There's definitely a difference when you think of European countries and the United States of spending. So that's something that we think of just GDP per capita, but what about healthcare system? That's a great way to think about. We can't just focus on economic growth without also thinking about healthcare, because health affects all of us, and life expectancy, for instance, big topic. So yeah, all these were great. And there was another list I was trying to try to add on. I was kind of adding it in the comment section. There's probably far more that we could, chew on. Work, labor, vacation. I think you put it under leisure, leisure time. One of the indicators. One thing I noticed you didn't have is trade union density, unless I missed it. I don't think you had that one in
No,
there.
I did not discuss the
Yeah.
power of
Okay.
labor
Okay. Yeah.
unions. I mean, obviously, like in an essay, you can always add more things,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
only touch kind of the surface and what you thought about at the moment. So clearly, I mean, uh,
Also, I think you mentioned it briefly, but you went into urban life, and that also can translate into quality life. And I was thinking about levels of pollution or exposure to pollution. I mean, if we think of it just pure economic growth, it would almost ignore levels of pollution that individuals may be affected by. So in particular, I mean, because I live in Texas, but very close to the state of Texas, we have Louisiana. I mean, there is also a question of environmental, protection or environmental considerations, air pollution, quality of air quality, So those, I guess those are called livability indicators, and we also may have to consider, especially if people increasingly live in urban spaces, urban environment. Um, and wealth matters where people live. If they're more affluent communities, or if someone is urban poor, that could definitely impact quality of life, depending on where you live, your zip code. All those are fair discussions, I think. Definitely, definitely. So yeah, I think you made a long list of possible discussions. We can go in a variety of directions there. I don't
Yeah,
know
I
where
mean,
you
for
want
the
to.
air pollution
Yeah,
thing, I
yeah,
think I did not discuss that, but I at
yeah.
the end in the conclusion I did discuss the climate change and kind of the environmental impacts, environmental consequences
Okay,
of
yeah,
basically economic growth, where it clearly will diminish the quality of life. So I'm just gonna do a little
yeah,
bit of the screen sharing,
yeah.
so
Perfect,
that
perfect. Then we can actually see the graphs and statistics,
yeah,
right?
the viewers, they want to have a look at
Yeah.
basically what the
Those are
argument
also
overall
on
is.
Facebook. Yeah, and you're going to post it on your blog. Oh, that's your blog. Yeah, there we go.
That's right. Yeah, so the economic statistics would simply
Hmm.
suggest that the U.S. is doing much better economically than the other like G7 countries,
Hmm.
and that trend of divergence is intensifying over the last few years. If you look at AI, right, artificial intelligence, um, a lot of these things are developed over here in the U.S. Um, Also, like if you look at the median age of the U.S., I think is younger than many of the other G7 countries, and that also is beneficial to the U.S. economy in terms of
Yeah.
the total output.
Younger
Uh,
workforce, right? Yeah.
yeah, the younger workforce that we have. And also the fact that we are working longer hours over here than
Mm.
we do in the European countries, where there's heavier focus on like vacation periods, for instance. So there's a bunch of factors that kind of explain this divergence in the incomes between the U.S. and the other countries.
Mm.
Um, and the kind of simple narrative is to say, hey, everything is going to be better if you have higher levels of income. But the important point I want to raise is that uh, there's also like quality of life indicators, right?
Mhm.
Which are basically very subjective perceptions about whether my life is good or not. Um, and those might not be covered in the very narrow GDP
Mhm.
indicators. Um, there were researchers, Kahneman and Deaton. They were economists, ecologists,
Mhm.
and they were doing basically survey based research, looking at people's annual income, and then the fraction of people that are experiencing happiness. I think they have like three different indicators of happiness. The important one is the thick line, the thick dotted line, because it's the average of those three lines, which shows that I think their main finding was that there's diminishing marginal returns, basically.
Mhm.
I mean, is it like so? It is true, like the higher your income, like the higher your life satisfaction, right?
Mhm.
Um, but but it does flatten out eventually. Well, I mean,
Mhm.
the thick line I think makes it seem like it keeps going up a lot, but with the other lines, you can see that after the $75,000 mark, you're going to see flattening out, which in my view, I mean, makes a lot of sense because like if you're like really poor, right?
Mhm.
So you're not eating, good food
healthy
at
food,
all, right? I mean, you
ultra
barely.
processed.
Well, I mean, like
Yeah,
I say, if you're really poor, you might be starving, right? That's really at the lowest
yeah,
end, right?
yeah.
So, your quality of life is going to be very low. If your income goes up by a little, now it's like, okay, now I can eat bread, I can eat it every day.
Salmon steaks, yeah, lobster.
Um, well, the
Hmm.
lobster is much later. The lobster will
Yeah.
be
Oh,
at very high levels of income.
right, upper
If
class.
you're only going to be eating bread, you're going to be malnourished, because you're not going to be getting, essential amino acids, proteins and fats and vitamins and minerals. Um, uh, but so the higher level of income, so then you start getting into the, meat, like the steak, the lobsters, as you mentioned, into that
Hmm.
territory. You could probably afford it, in most rich countries, up, a certain level of income. Once you're able to eat the good food, and then you can extend it further, right? You can buy, a nice car, you can buy a bigger house.
Hmm.
Um, but there will come a point. There's just going to be a certain income threshold, right? Where if you reach that, um, you know, there's not much more that you could consume, right?
You reach the limit,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So, like somebody like, the extreme example like Jeff Bezos, right? I
Mm.
mean, like he has multiple billions of dollars. He's clearly not spending it all. He's incapable of doing so. Even though he already has, a nice yacht and everything, right?
Hmm.
So that diminishing marginal return idea, which was developed by economists, I think makes a whole lot of sense. And
Yeah,
so
okay.
and so I developed a series of
Indicators, yeah.
indicators, uh, where I think that, the U.S. has very high levels of income, but might be doing poorly on those quality of life indicators, right?
Hmm.
So health is probably one of the examples that come to the top of the mind, because you have, very high per capita expenditure, so very high spending on the healthcare. And over the years, right? This is the evolution.
That's, yeah.
But the life expectancy is kind of like less than the other rich countries. And so we have a high GDP that we're devoting towards the healthcare system, but we're not getting much in return.
Yeah, bad
Um,
outcome. Yeah.
yeah,
It,
and I
it, it,
notice. Yeah,
mhm.
you want to add something to that, or?
Well, also, I mean, this topic is discussed right now with in the news, the killing of the health CEO, insurance person that was killed. There's lots of, ambivalent discussions about this issue that the US is one of the richest, countries, and it has this problem with the healthcare system and access to healthcare and this, health insurance system, and that I guess that graph pretty much illustrates it's a dilemma. I mean, it's a rich country, and then you have really poor health care outcomes, even though you're pouring so much money into it. So yeah, compared to other countries that don't have as much GDP, so yeah,
Well, I mean, so
it's a
I
bit
did
tough.
mention that there were
Yeah.
certain like non-monetary factors
Mhm.
that are,
Cultural.
basically causing, the higher mortality rates. I think I mentioned here.
Oh yeah, you did
Um,
mention the CEO. Yeah. Okay. United
uh,
Healthcare CEO. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, so yeah, the cars, um, the level of gun violence, and the ultra processed foods, right?
Yeah.
So, all of these indicators make life much riskier, I would say. So, that intersects with what I'll talk about later, the car
Would you,
dependence.
Larry, would you the deaths of despair thesis, would that also fit with this indicator, you think? the deaths of despair, kind of thesis or hypothesis that there's an intersection between certain policies where there's a increase of people with alcoholism. What's the other one? Suicide, I believe, is another indicator for deaths of despair. Uh,
And then the
Decay of
drugs.
yeah, drugs, pharmaceutical, people getting addicted to certain prescription drugs. That this is also kind of correlated or related to question of health and health outcomes and disparities, so yeah, that's what I was thinking. When I was thinking this, I was kind of thinking about the deaths of despair thesis.
Yeah,
That was
I think that's a very good
yeah,
addition that I did not mention here.
yeah, because you
Sure.
did put gun deaths in there. Yeah, suicide, gun deaths.
Yeah, that death of despair. Yeah, I mean, like liberal gun laws, I think are definitely a part of that. But then, on top of that, you have kind of poor mental health, and then the Angus Deaton thesis, the low mental health comes from the economic changes, right? Where
Mhm.
basically people who were displaced from high paying manufacturing jobs were then put in a situation where they couldn't take care of their families financially.
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
especially affects men because, for instance, women that have low incomes, their mental health is not as much impacted.
Mhm.
It is as well, but not as much. And that tells you about the male breadwinner model, right? That
Yeah.
is part of the culture, and that certainly lowers the mental health, and that also increases the or lowers the life expectancy, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Definitely. Yeah.
and Yeah, the car dependence, we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the gun
Sounds good.
violence, which comes from liberal gun laws, people with mental disorders, they can just
Purchase
kill lots
gun.
of people. I'm sure you heard about the Magdeburg killings,
Yeah,
Germany.
that happened
Um,
yesterday, I believe. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it
It was a
was
doctor. Yeah. Or
like this guy
I
from
heard
like
about.
Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and and it was quite interesting. Initially, like the AFD, the right wing party,
Hmm.
were saying, well, look, this was a Saudi citizen who did that, and
Hmm.
therefore we have to punish these, Islamists who are,
Yeah.
infiltrating the German society, and they are, basically destroying the Christmas festivities in Germany.
Right.
Um, and then it turns out when
The
it looked
narrative
at
doesn't fit, right? The narrative doesn't fit.
yeah,
Yeah.
the narrative doesn't fit because I mean, it was a Saudi national, but
Hmm.
who had been living in Germany for almost 20 years. And he's actually an atheist,
Hmm.
very anti-Muslim, and he's a supporter of Elon Musk and AFD and
Hmm.
Trump and kind of the right-wing
Yeah.
ideas. Um, and then apparently the AFD then switched the narrative. Now they're saying
Yeah.
that we have to, just deport foreigners, right? So
Yeah.
they dropped the Islamophobia argument, right?
And Germany has Bundestag elections in February, so this is just 2 months away.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a very high tension
Yeah.
political situation at this
Yep.
point.
Yeah.
And But anyway, I mean,
Mm.
so like yeah, so it was a car that killed quite a few people in Germany. But kind of like a guy who takes out an AR-15,
Hmm.
right, and you know kills a large number of people in like a crowded place, like a Christmas market. Um, like that kind of incidents would be more likely to happen in the U.S., right, than
Yeah.
in Germany. I mean, in Germany, I mean, and not just in Germany, I saw in the UK, and I mean, there were other places in Europe where like like car rampages had been uh, very
More
deadly
common.
as
Yeah.
a terrorist attack. And
Knife attacks too. I think there's more knife attacks.
yeah,
Just random knife use. But you're right, they don't have this overwhelming gun access. Because more regulation of guns in Europe generally, but in the U.S. you have this very open market. It's just anybody can get a gun. You can walk into any sporting goods store or gun dealer. It's here in the South particularly. I mean, it is very open access and very little regulation of being able to not purchase a gun. You can easily purchase an AR-15. Not even so far away from here where I live, there are small gun owners that's their business. They have, even in Christmas, I mean, it's a big market. People use it as gifts and presents, but yeah, it's a big issue, a big topic, of accessibility of guns and weaponry in the United States, definitely.
yeah. And so the main
Compared to
idea
Europe.
is,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, you can have crazy people anywhere, right?
yeah,
But but you could kill just a lot more people
yeah.
with the guns, right? And that's what happens. Um, yeah, and then the ultra processed foods, those are that's a very serious issue. Um, there are certain like food ingredients in the ultra processed foods that are quite unique to the US. Like food dyes, various chemicals that are prohibited, under EU law, and
Mhm.
therefore, they have a much more stringent regulations. And we have much fewer of those regulations, so people can, more easily, uh, you know, basically
Mhm.
get sick from the kind of food that we have here.
And if I can mention one thing, I mean, one way to easily notice this is the amount of food recalls that we just become used to. I mean, food recalls for E. coli, or certain issues with the food. Uh, it's more and more common. I mean, you get more and more food recalls. People are told not to consume this, and they already have it in their freezer, refrigerator. It's just more common than what I remember. I mean, when I do occasionally, talk to my relatives in Europe, they don't seem to have that. They occasionally have food recalls, but not as persistent as we have it here. Just all the time we have food recalls. So that's the first example too. I mean, quality of food, lack of food options, quality food, is a big
Yeah,
concern.
I mean, the anecdote that I like to tell, I mean, among the American friends, I mean, that travel to the European countries, and they eat, let's say in Italy, they'd be eating, the pastas and the pizzas, quite similar dishes to what you would find over here. And they're saying they're losing weight. While if they ate the same thing, over here, they'd be gaining weight, right?
Yeah, just
Um,
because the ingredients too, are different. Sugar, like processed. US, I mean, yeah.
yeah, the US is more processing, and then there
Yeah.
is more sugar added to it. While it looks like, for the Italian or the European foods, it's closest to like how nature designed those foods,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then those have the least harmful impacts on the body because we have evolved over you know you know millennia basically to eat those foods, while the foods over here, um, it's something that is very, very recent, right? Like for instance, like the vegetable oils, right? Seed oils is a technology that we've had for about more than 100 years, I would say. It's about 1910. Before that, there's no human on this planet who has, ever cooked in cottonseed oil or canola oil and soybean oil, etc.
Mhm.
And you can see the
Hmm.
numbers. 1980 is really the cutoff point for overweight and obesity, right? And the U.S. was already doing pretty badly back then, but uh, but it is a trend that was just shooting up right around that time period. 1977 was an interesting year in the food history in this country, because there was a Senate committee by South Dakota Senator George McGovern,
Hmm.
and he and his committee published the first national food guidelines, dietary recommendations, um, and
Food pyramid, right? Food pyramid.
the food
Is that?
pyramid.
Yeah.
Um, but the food pyramid, I think, goes back to 1950s. It's a little bit older than
Oh,
that.
oops.
But that national guideline, which I was very closely built on that original food pyramid, was then being promoted, where they were saying that for a healthy diet you have to eat um, like a certain amount of grains, whole grains as they call it, certain amount of fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, um, and then a low amount of saturated fats, which would be in the form of like poultry and fish, right? That was the official dietary recommendation that was put out at that time. And if you look at the more recent iteration that the U.S. Department of Agriculture releases on food guidelines, they're virtually unchanged, right?
Hmm.
Regardless of what the evidence, has been on like alternative diets, like low
Yeah.
carbohydrate diets, for instance, that would do much more to lower weight. So with these like kind of wrong dietary advice guidance,
Hmm.
plus the addition of these ultra processed foods, that was by these food companies. That's how the population gets sick. Um,
Yeah.
the ultra processed food, like when you eat it, it doesn't satiate you, right? It spikes your glucose, your insulin, and it comes down, and then you're gonna crave something more. So it kind of puts you in this like hamster in a wheel kind of phenomenon, right? Where you just keep eating more and more without feeling satiated at all.
It's
Um,
just bad. Yeah. Over has bad outcomes. I,
yeah, and
yeah.
now the thing is, okay, so yeah, so the U.S. curve is very steep,
Hmm.
but I mean, if you look at like Australia, England, Canada, okay, so all the other
Yeah. Italy,
countries, even
Korea,
Austria, I mean, you see an
okay.
increase.
Yeah.
Um,
France,
yeah,
Italy.
so in all of the countries in the world, so that's why I mean, like this, obesity crisis, I think is kind of, I mean, we have to globally take a look at it.
Definitely.
Um, because I know, for instance, I was watching a food video about like Mexico, right, in the Yucatan state, and everybody in the restaurants was like drinking Coca-Cola, right?
Yeah.
It was either Coca-Cola, it was Pepsi, right? Clearly, I mean, not the wise thing to do, right? Uh, but yeah, I mean, so if you enter these ultra processed foods that are generated in Western food companies, you're gonna start seeing metabolic problems
Yeah.
spreading all over the world. I was just talking
Because
with a South Asian friend, Pakistan,
hmm
and then he was talking like when he was a child, they would be eating ghee, right, which is
hmm
clarified butter,
hmm
which is nice for cooking because it burns less likely than butter. And he was saying that, well, at some point everybody switched over to the soybean oil and to the seed oils,
Hmm.
because they were told that the ghee, the animal fats, would give them heart attacks.
Hmm.
And so then they switched over to the seed oils.
Which are
And now,
worse, right? Yeah.
which are worse, because now, I
Yeah.
mean, if you look at the obesity numbers, they are going up in India, all over South Asia. Um, fatty liver disease. Fatty liver disease, for people that are skinny, physically, is much more of a serious problem in India and South Asia than it is for all the other ethnic groups,
Hmm.
because the South Asians have, fewer fat cells where they could store the excess in the caloric intake. So they have to be worried about the fatty liver disease and diabetes much earlier than other ethnic groups.
Larry, could you attribute these obesity rates partially also with the rising fast food sector? I mean, that it's becoming more and more bigger and more fast food industries. I know, certain fast food goes back into the 1950s in the United States, but the only other thing I was thinking of, like you said, ultra processed foods, but then also fast food sector that becomes, larger and larger, that it increases from 1980 like to 2020. And yeah, that this is sadly the lack of food options in the risk society. I don't want to use that as a theme, but food options become more and more narrow and people don't have more food options. It's expensive to buy like organic food, or whole foods. So people get kind of lured into the fast food sector or even TV dinners, I guess you can say. All of that stuff is, ultra processed, very bad. Sodas, things like that. I don't know. What do you think? You think a fast food sector? I mean, I don't want to blame it just on one sector, but
Fast food is an expanding sector for
yeah.
sure. And
I was,
everywhere where you're seeing growth in like McDonald's and KFC, you
yeah.
see, like, with a few years delay, you're going to see an increase in, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and other yeah, like metabolic diseases.
Problem. Yeah,
So there definitely is a clear correlation, and it fits with this kind of, you know
yeah.
capitalist model where you are trying to sell, high margin foods that are highly palatable, right? Like highly, like very tasty,
Hmm.
very addictive.
High
Uh,
calorie.
yeah, and then
Or
high,
cheap calorie. Cheap calorie.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then
Uh,
the lower quality ones, and as I said, like, like the hamburger patty is gonna be the healthiest thing that you're gonna be eating in a hamburger, right?
mhm.
So if you're gonna be eating, hamburger patties every day of your life, you're gonna be, and also the cheese and the whatever, the tomatoes on top and the onions, you're gonna be in perfect health. But yeah, if you're gonna be eating the buns and the ketchup and the French fries and the Coke,
Mayonnaise. Yeah.
the mayonnaise with it,
Yeah.
um, then yes, you're gonna be sick eventually. So it has to be, there's certain parts of the hamburger actually where it's actually really healthy.
Hmm.
Um, right. So
We
that
can
that, that
discuss.
so that's the health thing, right? So
Yeah.
we're gonna, increase the profit for the food and the medical industry. We're gonna create jobs for people in those sectors. Um, because obviously the link is like, if you eat the ultra processed food, right? If you eat the fast food, you're gonna get sick. Then you're gonna go to the doctor, and the
Hmm.
doctor is gonna give you a prescription, right? Is not gonna tell you to improve your diet. It's only gonna give you the prescription drugs that
Hmm.
will control your symptoms, going to make billions of dollars in
Hmm.
profits to the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah. Or
Um,
private equity. Yeah. Firms. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I saw this headline. It was a conference call at Goldman Sachs, one of the big investors in
Hmm.
both industries, big food and big pharma. And they were saying, does it make sense um, to uh, to
Get people
invest
cured or something. You want to create a
to invest in
pro-
like these
yeah.
drugs, like let's say Ozempic, right?
Mhm.
Ozempic, Wegovy, the weight loss drugs. Does it make sense for us to invest in those drugs, given that it will reduce the demand for other drugs, assuming that people
Mhm.
become healthier if they eat less,
Mhm.
and also they will make less money for the food companies because people will be eating less food. Um,
Yeah.
so they were kind of like saying that yes, we're making money from the Ozempic right now, but in the future we could be making much less money because people are going to be healthier, right? Presumably.
Yeah.
Um,
So that would be a disincentive for them. Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, like, look,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're an investor, I mean, you're still going to buy the shares of Novo Nordisk, right? Of this,
Mhm.
Ozempic producers, right? Um,
Mhm.
but it's just something like it tells you how like the profit incentive goes contrary to what's good for the people, right?
Mhm.
What's
Same
good
way
for the
with
common people.
environmental, think of planned obsolescence. I mean, the whole idea of creating things so that you become obsolete or you have to buy another light bulb, or another piece for your car every 2, 3 years.
Yeah, I
So,
mean,
or
it's
a
like
new microwave or I guess the same thing with medical products that you create a system where there's a permanent need and that it doesn't become obsolete,
yeah, I mean,
in the
if people are
medical, yeah.
sick, right? If people are
Yeah.
sick, they're going to keep buying those drugs, right? And they keep
Hmm.
eating those drugs. And
Yeah.
so there aren't actually any incentives. I mean, except for like some, like I learned a lot about health issues just through watching YouTube videos. So a lot of the YouTube gurus, they start preaching, the healthy diet. And of course, like, well, the incentive is to get views, right? To get clicks. Um, but they're not making any money from selling the drugs, right? They're not making any money from selling the food itself. So they can give you the health advice actually that is very effective, right?
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, and so basically we have opposite incentives, right, between the different actors here.
Yeah.
And I would say that the food and medical industry incentive is the one that is the most harmful to the population, even though in the short term, yes, we have we have a bigger medical industry and we have a bigger food industry than the other OECD countries,
Yeah.
and that inflates our GDP,
Hmm.
but it doesn't improve our health, right? So
Hmm. Yeah.
that's something to consider.
Pretty good. Yeah. Definitely a indicator to examine carefully, like you said. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Urban
The
life.
urban life transportation. I don't think had produced a graph here, but the simple idea is
Okay.
that if you that there was a deliberate governmental policy to support like the interstate highways, right?
Hmm.
To basically remove the streetcars, right? Which many U.S. cities used to have those streetcars. Nowadays, you only have the bus lines, and the bus lines they only run in kind of like the big
Hmm.
like streets. So it's actually very inconvenient. It's mostly low income people. I know in Baltimore, Philly, like all these places I lived in, um, like the public bus lines, uh, they are designed for poor people, right? Who
Hmm.
cannot afford cars. And they oftentimes they say, I mean, how difficult it is for them to go to work or to go to the doctor or to go to the supermarket, right? Um, because they don't live right by where the bus line is, right?
Yeah.
Like if I wanted to commute to work with a bus line, I mean, it would take me about an hour instead of 12-minute driving, right? Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Which can cause additional stress on individuals who depend on having to commute longer distances to get to work. Another way to think about it, that I mean, this is a great indicator that you mentioned, is the decay of infrastructure and certain neighborhoods, there's potholes, people damage their vehicles, but also don't have access to the city like everybody else. So the city becomes segregated and divided by wealth, income, and access. So if you live in an affluent environment, proximity to universities, and maybe even a Costco or something, or even a hospital. But if you live outside the city, maybe you live in a trailer park, you don't have lighting like everybody else, you don't have the way to transport, you don't have transportation access. And yeah, that can really make a difference, quality of life. And whether you are part of the community, you can go to your city council meeting, you can access a public library or not. Uh, you really start to see it in the South. Some communities can be very much disconnected just because you don't have a vehicle. And then you are disconnected from political participation. You can't access a public park because it's so far away. If you have a car, it breaks down. How are you going to get your groceries? So it accumulates. I think it's a cumulative disadvantages uh, because of a missing public transportation system. Yeah, it often is, poor shape, or there's a lot of defunding sometimes. There's some disinvestment. Uh, and also the excess of toll roads, also have benefits and consequences. Toll roads are often highly debated. Parking is a big topic. I don't know. I'm sure in Baltimore and Philly, but that's another market, a lot of money involved in
Yeah, there's a lot of
parking.
money in
Yeah,
parking
it's
for sure.
yeah, but yeah, it's a huge topic. I mean, again, I speak from my experiences in the South. Northeast, I've seen also this problem play out because of you know, profit entities that also make money off of parking spaces, and then there's cities that also kind of start charging people certain places that they have to pay to park. But in the South, what's interesting is some of the infrastructure is overwhelmed, and the highways are the only way how you can get to point A to point B. There are some light railway, for instance, even in Dallas, but again, it's only certain communities have access to it, and then there's just overwhelming amount of dependency on the car, right? And where communities emerge and how the distance between different areas of the city and cost to be mobile. There's a high cost. You got to pay for fuel, car maintenance, and time you spend commuting. It's a big, big, big problem. And then elderly. I mean, I can imagine elderly people at a certain point, they can't, drive cars forever. And then even elderly populations have problems later. Then how do they become mobile if everything is so centered around the vehicle and car? You know, um, yeah, it becomes a real disadvantage.
Yeah, I mean, so the
Yeah.
point that you mentioned here, I think, is quite important that we generate, a huge amount of economic value, right, by having a car dependent culture. I mean, like let's say if you had like, in Vienna you can buy the 365 euro ticket, right?
Hmm.
And then you can just
Oh,
ride it wherever you want, and I mean, which is
for a year? That's for a year?
if that's for an
Well,
entire year, yeah, yeah.
in Germany, there's a Deutschland ticket. I think it's 49 euros. I don't know if it's a month. I think it might be a month.
Yeah, I think it's a month, yeah.
Okay, so maybe that's about the same. Okay.
Now, but for Germany, it's kind of like it's a national one, right? So you can
Hmm.
travel by train between cities, right?
Hmm.
For Vienna, I think it's a public transportation system for that city. And I mean, obviously, like so, if you live outside of Vienna, like if you let's say if you live in the suburbs of Vienna, then that then the public transit situation is probably as crappy as it is over here, right?
Right, right.
You'll probably have to wait like for an hour to get to like the main bus line, right? That only takes you to the main road, right?
But more bicycles, right? I mean, riding bicycles, far more, right?
Yeah, yeah, they do have like, a
Uh,
lot of bike trails and stuff. But if you're inside of, of Vienna, then you can ride the public transit quite literally anywhere. And so many people, many Viennese, they don't own cars at all, right?
mm,
Whereas I mean, the amount of money that you have to spend, like purchasing the car, a new car,
car
20,
insurance.
$30,000, right?
Yeah.
Then you're gonna pay for the car insurance and the gas. You're gonna pay for all of the repairs, right?
Hmm.
That due on the car, right? Um, and and I would say the only people that have their quality of life increased through the car ownership are the car aficionados, right? Like Jay
Hmm.
Leno, I just picked as example because he
Hmm.
has like this car show.
Hmm.
Um, but for most other people, it's just like, well, if I just want to go from A to B, I just want to commute to work, and I don't want to sit in like traffic
Yeah.
jam right during rush hour.
Yeah.
Um,
I wonder though that there's another component. Maybe we didn't think about it. Just keeping up with the Joneses the car as a status symbol that people can label their social class, economic class, and there's often this kind of, showboating. I don't know what you call it. Like people drive their car so they can see, oh, I have this new car. Oh, I'm somebody in the community, I have. So there's something cultural too, some cultural fascination with luxury cars, for instance, or big SUVs, or that it becomes, keeping up with the Joneses. You're like, you're okay. We got to get a new car every year, and we got to get this new version of it, right? So it creates a market within a market almost. Um, so I thought that there's something cultural too. And I mean, if you drive out on US highways, you do kind of get this feeling that it's not just about transportation. It's about, you got this car you can drive and show that you have this nice, whatever Lexus or Tesla, or big nice SUV. Or I start noticing more in affluent communities, more maybe also suburbs. But in working class communities, my impression is it's just like a work vehicle. I'm just going from a point A to point B. I don't care how my car looks. But I think if you think of affluent communities, the car becomes an extension of one's social class, right?
yeah, I mean, I used
But
to live in a
yeah,
very affluent area in New Jersey, right, in
uh,
Princeton, and I would say that at least one third of my neighbors were driving a Tesla, probably, right?
uh,
It was a pretty high number, I would say, just like jogging around the neighborhood. And over here, it's like it's very rare. I mean, it's like I see a few electric cars, like a Hyundai or something, or a Ford, but
mhm.
a few Teslas, but not that many actually. And this is kind of like a middle class neighborhood in northern Baltimore. The most common cars are still, like your Dodges and stuff, and also like the Toyotas and the
Yeah.
Hondas and
And
stuff.
I have to ask, Larry, are car washes a big thing in the Northeast? Car washes, car wash centers, big car wash.
Well, they
Yeah.
exist. They're
Yeah.
here.
There's
We
an
have them.
I noticed an industry kind of emerges. It's like a huge industry. Car wash and is a big thing here in Texas at least.
Yeah, which I
Here.
personally never understand. I mean, like if
Yeah.
I have, I mean, I have a lot of like bird crap on my car, on the windows and stuff, and I'm
Right.
just like, well, I mean, you drive it home and then you take you know, a paper
Mhm.
towel and then and then you have a little bit of that spray, right? That
Mhm.
glass cleaning spray or something,
Yeah.
and you can just wipe it off, right? I mean, what's the big deal? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't understand the full fascination with like needing to have like a nice shiny car, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
spending time with that.
Creates environmental problems, pollution too, excess of water reusage and car washes and all that. Yeah. Yeah. Big topic. So how
Yeah,
you got housing too? Yeah, you got
yeah.
housing.
So housing is directly connected with the cars because the cars allow you. like distance, right? Long distances. And and housing takes a lot of land, so you need the long distance, right?
Hmm.
Versus I think we discussed this a previous time that um, if like this idea of like high density living, right?
Hmm.
Like going up like 6 stories, right? It's more popular in European countries where they have, just kind of like less excess space. They're much more compact. They have a larger population than the US and also larger population density. So they're kind of used to that concept of like compact living. Um, in the US, because there's so much more land, so you can kind of spread out more easily. And it's a government policy, right? So the New Deal legislation, right? The
Hmm.
Federal Housing Administration, where there was clearly racial bias through the redlining as a
Hmm.
policy. But the important point is that it was the government itself that at some point decided that, hey, we want to support people to buy these houses. And then you're gonna have a big backyard. Yes, you're gonna have extra bedrooms, right? Um, but the expenditures are gonna be much higher as well. The hassle of maintaining it is gonna be much higher. Um, and so
Yeah, very good.
and so and then the other point I made, I think, was about the inequality, right?
Definitely, yeah.
You know, that comes with it, right? Because if you have middle class people, they're like, well, we're going to retreat into our nice suburbs.
Hmm.
We're going to have our nice Starbucks and Whole Foods and various kinds of services, right? And we're going to be taking those resources then away from those poor people, right, who stay in the city. And then you're going to have this issue of quality of life, um, where because of that housing segregation, you're going to have resource segregation too, right?
Hmm.
And so you're going to have very low quality of life for people that are not living in the nice affluent areas. I mean, like my neighborhood, I mean, if you go a couple of blocks up north, I mean, you have this swimming pool.
Hmm.
It's a swimming pool,
Public? Is it
just
public or private swimming pool?
well, it's a private
Oh, oh,
for
okay.
that community, for the community residents, right?
Hmm.
But you can see it from the outside, right? And now it's covered up because it's winter, but in the summertime, you're gonna have this open air kind of swimming pool for the residents. So it's really nice, right? Very nice service. Um, but um, but yeah, and then if you go into the downtown area, into the lower income neighborhoods, I mean, you see kind of like the graffitis and boarded up shops and
Hmm.
boarded up houses. There are a lot of wheat that's growing in like these empty parking lots. Um, and very few kind of businesses that are there, like a few barber shops, a few fried chicken places, takeouts. So yeah, a huge economic contrast, right?
Hmm.
And so that's a factor for lower quality of life.
Yeah.
Um, Versus, I mean, like in Vienna, I mean, like it would be very hard to find like a true ghetto, right? Like, sure, I
Hmm.
mean, there are areas that are like poorer off, there are areas that are better off, but but the city government, I mean, they have a lot of resource allocation power, right? Like you notice in every neighborhood, in Vienna, you're gonna have a public library, right?
Hmm.
There's probably gonna be a public swimming pool. There's gonna be public parks, right? And they're gonna be maintained by the municipal
Government,
maintenance
right?
workers, right?
Right.
Um, so it just like,
Even public housing stock, right? Public or social housing.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and you can already imagine like it doesn't generate as much of a GDP as kind of the the housing model, the suburban housing model in the US, right?
Mhm.
Um, but but the housing stock that they do have and the services that they have in those neighborhoods are going to be, you know, pretty good and done in a very uniform way, right? Um, and so then I would say, yeah, you can. So in that sense, if you have kind of a more socialistic allocation of urban resources, you can have a lower total GDP with a higher quality of life,
Mhm.
right?
Less of
Uh,
the cost is attributed to housing, right? In Europe, I mean, it would be less, or
yeah,
at
that's
least
right.
it's a little bit more equal, more not so profit driven. So I
Yeah,
guess
that's right.
one thing I wanted to add, I mean, when I think of housing, I immediately, I mean, when I'm thinking as a sociologist, is that it's very highly socially stratified in the United States. And mansions to townhomes to who has a brick house to rental market to trailer park. I mean, it goes all the way down to day hotels and all the way homeless. I mean, so one of the things when I think about housing in the US is this is extremely stratified, and it's almost connected to one's income, one's occupation, and what someone can afford. And the cities model almost the social class reality. Whereas I guess in Europe there's a little bit of buffering, that you have public institutions that can intervene, that can sort of try to assist, especially with housing, assisting. And I know in Germany there's a lot of assistance where they even pay Wohngeld. It's like a little subsidy where lower incomes get a little bit of a money for housing, so it somewhat offsets this high rent rate, you know. Uh, so yeah, but housing usually when I think of it, it's almost like totally, for me at least, totally connected to stratification, that society, we can see it very stratified, and one's income is connected to one can afford to live in certain part of the city or not, or forced out totally. I think they had last year I was looking at some statistics, the amount of income that rent takes for some individuals, even in North Texas, could be somewhere as high as 49%. So just the rental payment, it takes up almost half of their income, you know, in some situations. So I can imagine if housing gets more and more expensive, that people spend a large portion of their income on housing, that can become problematic. Let's say if you spend like 60% on rent and you have only, 40% left, right, to spend on everything else, that can become a hard life and a bad quality of life outcome, right? We agree, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very
So
little disposable income left that people have left to spend on other things. The housing takes so much of it.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, even if you have much more space, I mean, you're going to be much more burdened by the rent. I mean, I kind of took the example of the average American middle class homeowner versus the kind of like a European tenant.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, I mean, like let's say if you live in non-market rental housing, so in basically public housing,
Mhm.
you're gonna have the rental value is capped, right? So you never have the opportunity to buy the house, the apartment, because it's a government building, right? But you'll be able to rent it at a very low cost. Um, and in that sense, you're going to be spending less money on that housing
Mhm.
than the American middle class homeowner, who paid off all of his mortgage, right?
Mhm.
So even like just the property tax and the utility bills, right? And whatever maintenance expenditures. is going to be, could be higher than, than the monthly rental
Hmm.
in a European apartment. Now, okay, so now you might say it's not completely comparable because again, you're going to be
Yeah.
you have the house, you're going to have the extra bedrooms, you're going to have the backyard, you're going to have your barbecue, right?
Hmm.
Which you don't have in the European apartment.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true.
but I don't know. I mean, it's like a lot of like urbanites, the young professionals. I mean, they don't really need to have a home grill anyway. I mean, they want to spend maybe more time in like bars, perhaps, right? And so kind of
Mhm.
like the third places, like the public venues, right? They want to go to, you know, I don't know, jazz bars or clubs or something like that. Um, and those, much easier to access in the cities
Mhm.
than in the suburbs, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I mean I'm not sure whether the quality of life is going to be less for you if you rent a public apartment, for most of your life, uh, compared to even somebody who paid off his entire mortgage. I mean, like,
Mhm.
and of course, when the average person, I mean, still has a mortgage to pay, right?
All right.
When you live in that house, so their expenditures are going to be way higher, for the house.
Isn't it fair to, I mean, fair to say that in Europe, much of the population, there's a larger population that are renters, and far more than the U.S. I mean, there's just land. I mean, it's challenging to become a homeowner. It's very expensive to build a house in Europe, so almost by default, everybody is a kind of a renter, at least working class people. That's the image that I have every time I go back to, Europe. I kind of see everybody's kind of renting, there's a renting culture. It's not like seen as something negative, but it's just a reality that the cities are built the way they are. And it's not like US where you have suburbs of popping up, and there's new development here, new development there. They still build houses, I think, and throughout Europe, but it's a luxury thing. I mean, it gets expensive. So easily 1 million or more, I mean more, even more than that, million euros, I'm saying. So by default, I think maybe it's more convenient for people to become renters, and yeah, well, that's a benefit for them. Then they don't have to worry about owning something and paying that.
Yeah,
So
I'd say
yeah.
certainly in the cities, especially. I mean, I think if you go into the countryside, or I mean, I do have um,
Mhm.
some relatives in the suburbs of Vienna, um, and they own the house, and if you visit them, I mean, it does have a very suburban feel to it, right? They have kind of like townhouses, and also single family houses too.
Mhm.
Um, so that certainly does exist. And Yeah, but for people that want to live in the city, um, I mean, obviously you have to consider like most of the jobs are going to be in the city, right?
Oh
So,
yeah.
so I mean, the convenience of like having like less than half an hour commutes, right? I think it cannot be, underestimated, and then you're probably okay like renting for most of your life, and yeah, and then maybe when you retire, right? Then and if you have like extra cash to spend, then I think people might look into
City,
like,
yeah.
yeah, like looking at the suburbs maybe to find a house, um, but I don't know. I mean, so it always varies. But I mean, but the main cultural difference is that I mean, I think over here in the U.S. there's so much expectation that people are supposed to own the houses, right?
Mhm.
And that's a much higher expectation over here than there.
Keeping keeping up with the Joneses, right?
Yeah, and then yeah,
Gotta build a
that's right.
house. Gotta have a
Um,
Tesla. Gotta have that, right?
yeah, and then if you have the house and the car, those are the two main consumer purchases, and And those purchases, right, the car loans and the mortgage, right, that's going to get you hooked, right, in the system. And so now you become very invested in, getting the promotion of the job and in like the stock market doing better every year, right? Because you invested money in it. As
Mhm.
it gets us back to that
Work
topic
and
of work
leisure.
and leisure.
Our favorite topic.
Um, yeah, so
Post-work society. Yes.
right, so if you look at the what's it, the average wages, it is so. I mean, the important line is the pink line, where it is higher for the U.S. Right? I think that's
Mhm.
the U.S. here. I don't know whether I can increase the zoom even further. Um, yeah, so the U.S. has the highest average wages, right? I think that's a solid line.
Mhm.
Um, and it has the highest GDP per hour worked, right? Um, and again, I put a question mark on it whether this purchases us a better life. I mean, it does purchases more stuff, right? I mean, we are able to buy more stuff. But then also you also have to consider that there's less of a socialized system, right? So the healthcare you have to buy yourself. The
Mhm.
housing, there's less of the social housing, so there's more, almost all private housing. Yeah, there's less of a public transportation system, so you have to buy more like your own cars. And so because there's less of the kind of like there's more commodification, right?
Yeah.
So you become more dependent on having
Mhm.
enough cash in order to obtain the basic necessities. Um, yeah, so I mean, so the Europeans, I mean, they have a lower take-home income, not just because they're producing, less money per hour of work, but also because the tax share is going to be higher, right?
Mhm.
So they're going to have to pay a higher percentage of their income in the taxes, both consumption and the income taxes. But then at the same time, like if you don't have to buy your own health insurance, you don't have, let's say, the full market housing. Um, you take the public transportation. So the amount of spending money that you need to have in order to live a decent life is going to be much less in the European countries.
Yeah.
That has to be taken into account, right? Where it's like, okay, I can have a much higher take home pay over here, right? But I might be, in terms of um my my uh buying patterns, I might be just as well off as somebody with, I don't know, 30% lower nominal wages in the European country.
Well, you have
Um,
more social benefits. You got universal health care. You get public institutions. You have better access. Uh, Probably more union protection, if not more union coverage. People are in some kind of contract or some bargaining, a collective bargaining agreement. So you definitely have those things going for you. Whereas I guess in the US, you have a kind of winner takes all mentality, and it's clearly reflected with the difference between CEO executive pay and the average medium pay of American workers. I think that's gone completely two different directions. Uh,
yeah,
Now, sometimes what I mentioned for those listeners, I mean, even I like using the AFL-CIO Executive Pay Watch. They have this tool that allows you to examine corporations, and what is the ratio of the CEO pay compared to the average median worker pay in that company. So just to give you an illustration, I'm gonna make a guess right now. I think for McDonald's, it's somewhere around 1 to 1200. So that would mean the CEO makes on average in a year 1,200 times more than what the average medium worker makes in that same company for one, right? That's just one example. I'm willing to, suspect that in Europe it's a little bit more equity. There's still differences between CEO pay and the average median pay of workers, but there's probably not that much of a gap, that the significant, difference. And that can reflect, if we just look at GDP per capita, that doesn't tell us anything about the differences between, a CEO position, and the average median worker pay. The differences that those two entities make. Uh, yeah, that's one thing I wanted to add. By the way, that's a big topic also for physicians and surgeons and doctors. They make far more in the United States than they do in Germany. There's a differences of income that those in different countries that they make, but the health outcomes are very different. So that goes back to the first indicator that I guess we were talking about
About
earlier.
health. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And the
I mean
argument
that
is that, you know,
the C go ahead, go ahead.
well, the top doctors, they're coming to the United States, right?
Mhm.
Because they can expect much higher compensation. And it's definitely true, like in terms of like innovative treatments, right? Like think of like, the newest cancer drugs, for instance, right?
Mhm.
It is true that they are developed in the US.
Yeah.
And if it's successful, then usually they get exported to the European countries or Canada or whatever. Um, so in terms of like the elite access to healthcare, I think we're probably the best in the world over here.
Okay.
Um,
A gentrification of healthcare, let's call it that.
yeah.
Would that be fair
Um,
to call it that?
yeah, I mean, but then the thing,
Yeah,
yeah, right, I mean,
yeah,
you cannot
yeah,
afford it, right? I mean, like for
yeah,
instance, there's so
yeah.
many cases. I mean, ever since that United Healthcare CEO murder, like you see a lot of social media stories of people, like stage 3, stage 4 cancer patients, and they're telling the horror stories about how United Healthcare was denying their insurance coverage, right? Um, basically denied the payment, right? Which, I mean, for some strange reason, I mean, it's still legal, right? I mean, I thought it was made illegal on Obamacare, but apparently they're still allowed to do it. Um,
It kind of echoes, I don't know, I was circulating a few, I guess about a week, the social murder quote by Engels. Did you see that one circulating by chance? The
I
social
haven't seen
murder
that one.
quote?
No.
Yeah, it's an old quote that Engels made in The Condition of the Working Class in England, where he was describing the horrible living conditions of English proletariat, like around 1845. And the argument of social murder quote means that that was by design, that there was a kind of, I don't want to say conspiracy theory, but it's like an elite down idea that people are left to, die, and there's no interest for institutions to save them. That became known as a social murder quote. People were using it, they were circulating, I guess the last few days. So anybody has time, you can look it up. It's an old quote. It's called the social murder quote by Engels. It's about a paragraph or more long, but it's striking. It's a really, I can see where people that have conspiracy theories they would use this, but like it's a unique kind of quote. I mean, anybody can read it, look it up. I had to throw that in there. I had to throw that in there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of significant injustices within
yeah,
the
yeah.
healthcare system, and that's definitely an issue that lowers the quality of life. Yeah. So the big difference in terms of work is the vacation time, right? So ultimately, I mean, the idea is that, well, I mean, if that there's a different priority, certainly among the European workers, right? That they work to live, they don't live to work, right? Which is kind of the U.S. mantra.
Hmm.
Um, where so you have like let's say I mean, in Vienna and Austria, you have like 5 weeks, paid vacation. Um,
Wow.
now per year. Now you have to
Huh.
notice that also like in the Austrian system, they have what's called the 13th and the 14th month salary, right?
Oh, what do you get
So
that after
yeah, so
January or something?
yeah, so the 13th month is basically it's kind of like the Christmas holiday, right? Pay.
Oh,
And then the 14th month is going to be the vacation pay, which you can
mm,
allocate however you like during the year. Um, and now, I mean, obviously, like, okay, the year only has 12 months, so where does the extra 2 months money come from? Well, I mean, it comes from the remaining 12 months, right? So you're just being paid a lower wage per month, right?
mm,
So that the employer then accrues the extra 2 months, right? And then pays it out at the end of that, I suppose, fiscal year. Um, and so yeah, that's just an additional factor where it's like, well, we're going to be paying you less money, right? Um, per month, but then we accrue, we help you save money basically, so that when you then go on a vacation, you don't act like like the European countries. They are encouraging the vacations because they don't force you to save the money for the vacation, right? Which, as a US worker, I mean, if you wanted to go on a vacation, you're kind of saving your own money, right?
yeah.
For that purpose. For the European workers, then they're not required to do so because the government kind of does it, or the employer does it for them, right?
That's interesting. Yeah.
Um, and so there's incentive to go on a vacation trip. Um, in the US is, I think, the only industrialized country doesn't have mandatory vacation at the federal level, right?
Mhm. And it's unpaid. I think it's like an unpaid, was it family back in 1993? Unpaid.
Yeah, the
So it's
unpaid family medical leave. So basically, what
yeah.
that is saying is that if you don't work for 3 months, as long as you give your boss notice, right? Like, your boss cannot fire you, right? That's all that the law was saying. It wasn't entitling you to cash, right?
Mhm. So
Um,
no basic income guarantee
yeah,
then
that's
for
right.
those three
Yeah,
months.
so that was the U.S. definition
Yeah.
of worker protection. I mean, which, I mean, in European years is like completely ridiculous. Because yeah, because I mean, you have like subsidized childcare. You have uh the
Parental
yeah,
leave.
parental leave, parental
Yeah.
allowance basically. So you get a certain amount of money. I believe it's a certain percentage of your last
Mhm.
salary. I think that gets paid by the state for a certain period of time. I would say at the very least, I would say the first year of the child's life. I would say you can basically take time off for
Yeah.
that. Um,
Yeah.
Now, but then the other argument that people are making is, well, you still have a higher fertility rate in the U.S., right,
Is it
than many European countries.
2.2, 2.3, something like
No, no,
that?
no, it's much lower than that. I mean, now
Oh, is it lower
it's
now?
like it's a
Okay.
1.6, I think.
Oh, really?
That's the
Japan must be lower than too, right? 1.3, something like that.
yeah, Japan is 1.3.
Okay.
And
South Korea too, right?
well,
Yeah.
South Korea is like zero point 0.7 or something. I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
I think they're the lowest in the world at this point. Um,
That's crazy.
they're probably being chased by like Taiwan and Singapore and other places with
Mm.
very low fertility. Um,
That's
but yeah,
that's another can of worms, that the post-industrial and this problem of fertility rates and yeah, it's another can of worms. We've talked about it before, but demography and population stuff.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
certainly, I mean, the collective decision of like not not having children. I saw this graph recently on the social media. It was about the the overtime trend of households, like what type of household is the most prevalent. And it turns out that the percentage of the households that are married with children, so married couples with children, has not changed much. So it's
Oh, continuity, huh?
that percentage is still about the same.
Okay.
Um, the percentage that has increased are the single people.
Hmm.
So the single people, um,
Are
of course,
increasing.
without children, right? In
Yeah.
most cases, I mean, singles are without children. Um, that is a category, that's a group that's been increasing in percentage terms. Um, and then the corresponding decrease would be for the people that, I would say, probably the married couples without children. I would say that's probably the one that's, or like just the cohabitation, like the unmarried, without children or something. That probably be decreasing. So yeah, so yeah, if you remember the argument by Melissa Kearney, right? The
Mhm.
economist, University of Maryland. I think her book was titled "The Two-Parent Privilege," and there's the simple idea is that, so if a couple does get married, it means that they are very likely to have children, right? Because they're both probably middle class. They probably earn pretty good salaries,
Mhm.
and they made the rational choice that, well, we get married, we now have these tax benefits, we can have the kids, right? We can afford the house, we can afford the extra bedroom, right? um and um and so, but then if you look at the, yeah, the total number of people that are getting married, I would say, that's probably declining, right?
Short
Total
decline, huh?
number of people getting married is probably declining, yeah. um
Yeah.
So, I mean, really, I mean, marriage. So that's why, I mean, the conservative argument is always like, okay, if you get married, then, the children's life is going to be better, right? But if you accept the economic argument that Kearney is making, then the marriage is not an explanatory variable. It is itself a dependent variable, right?
Mhm.
I mean, the explanatory variable is the economic security, right? So if you are economically secure, then you're gonna
And
get
you
married,
then
and
you
then
have
you're
more kids.
gonna have the kids, and then those kids will have a good life, right? It's not necessarily because the parents are married. I mean, well, I mean, it's helpful, but it's because the parents are economically secure. They're gonna stay married, and then they're gonna be able to take care of the kids, right? So,
Makes sense.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so ultimately, I mean, it's economic security. I mean, you have to fix that first.
Hmm.
But then again, the issue is that, if you have a rise in individualistic values, right? Individualistic value system, right? If you go back to, I think, did you
Yeah.
reproduce that graph of the like the Protestant individualism culture, right? The one
Oh,
extreme,
yeah, yeah.
and
Yeah.
and then you have
Think
kind of like the Islamic cultures as kind of the other extreme, right?
oh the the
Conservative.
the cultural map by the World Value Survey. Is that
But World
World
Values
Value?
Survey, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that one. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
Expressionist values, individualistic values. Yeah, there's an attempt to look at it through a cultural lens that could explain Western or more highly individualistic values that are driven towards a kind of individualism, but other societies may be driven on survivalist values or maybe that are not so interested in economic well, there's survivalist values, but yeah, in the West, this is trend where individualism becomes the main theme, and yeah, it's different from other value systems around the world where the individualism is not the thing. So that may explain the fertility rates are different in different societies, that the family and the community is valued more or other
Well, but
things.
but to the
Yeah.
extent that like the global fertility rate is declining, right?
Hmm.
And if we attach individualistic values with lower fertility, which I think is a very fair assumption,
Hmm.
my inference is that the individualistic values are the ones that are spread through the world.
Yeah.
And that basically kind of the other cultural extreme, right? Like think of like the Taliban, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
that's the other cultural extreme, right? The ones that say that, women are supposed to stay at home, they shouldn't work, get an education, they should, wear the veil, they should have a lot of kids, right?
Hmm.
Um, that kind of model, social model, right? Highly collectivist, highly patriarchal, um,
Hmm.
is actually the exception. It seems like,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Maybe also in the West, this idea of freedom of choice, and choice, freedom of choice, choice, yeah, like not to have children. And like you said, the Taliban, there's no choice. It's a closed society. It's not an open society. It's a closed society. So it's arranged marriage, and arranged this and that. So freedom of choice has unintended consequences, you might say, in the West, because then, yeah, there's more individualism, more choice, fertility choice. But again, there's no choice in closed societies. There's no choice in restrictive societies. So then may have unintended consequences, which means maybe hire more women, have more kids then by force. Forced. I don't know what you would use the word forced, but it's a restrictive society. Is that fair to
yeah,
say? I
that's a
mean,
model. That's a
I
model that
mean,
the Taliban
uh,
has. Yeah, sure.
yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think of another example. I think in Kenya or Chad, the fertility is something around 5 kids. And you might have a variety of other variables like, um, women in that society are value set. There's limited options for employment for women. So then survival sex, you gotta think about that. And there's I don't know. Those are all these variables that we could have to look at carefully. Uh, so families are also larger. Families are much larger. In the West, it seems the families are a lot smaller, getting increasingly a lot smaller, anyways. So yeah, so that's part of it too, right?
Yeah, I mean, the
Uh,
essential question is, I mean, how much, opportunities do, women have, and
mhm.
is an alternative to, having kids, and certainly, I mean, the most freedom exists in the Western cultures, quite frankly. I mean,
Yeah,
for women, they have more options to do their own things.
especially Scandinavia. Yeah, Scandinavia. I mean,
Yeah, because
Norway.
I saw this graph recently. It was about you know the level of childcare benefits um, correlated with the rate of fertility, right? And basically, there's no correlation at all. I mean, you have like the Scandinavian countries that have very high childcare benefits, but their
Mhm.
fertility rate is,
Horrible, right?
I mean, it's about as low as the
Yeah,
as the other countries that have much more stingy
yeah.
childcare benefits. So.
Which is the consequence of, I mean, freedom of choice, unintended, late has latent functions. You don't know how it could, like as far as decision ultimately made by individuals to have children, there's still other explanations, that people decide not to have kids. So then, yeah, what impact does the culture have or not have? It's kind of like you know what? This goes into the structure versus agency debate. Do you blame it on structures that are deterministic, or do you blame it on individual agency? After all, deciding to find a mate, I mean, or having this idea individuals have autonomy and have agency. I think it's both. I think it's maybe sometimes structures that are deterministic that produce certain outcomes, but sometimes it could be agency or lack of agency. Individuals also play a role in a society, in any society. So it could be both. That's why fertility is so complex, as it could be, not but it could also be individuals. It could be something related to policy. I don't know. I'm trying to think it through. Theoretically, at least. That doesn't always work out that way, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
fair.
for fertility, I mean, I think it's a big trend that we are observing, and it's very impactful, obviously, because is there going to be a future society, right? If you have, you know, like if you have like a fertility rate that's like less than 1.5 for a very long period of time, it will, it will basically get rid of that country, right? It will get rid of that species, right?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
right. So you have, yeah, more vacation time, and then even people that do take vacations in the U.S., right? The 2 weeks that they get by the corporate bosses, right? They'll still be checking their emails, while they're on the vacation, right? And it's a very different normative expectation. I mean, I know certainly among the Europeans, like when they go on a vacation, it's like 100% vacation, right? It's like they're supposed to leave all of the stuff in the workplace over there. They don't check the work emails.
Oh, that's a
Um,
big thing in Europe. I noticed that. Yeah.
yeah, they'll just have a good
That's
time. Um,
yeah.
I mean, one thing I noticed, like, let's say if you wanted to, um, not for the private sector businesses, but certainly if you want to get anything done from the government side, right? Like, yeah, I don't know, I want to get my passport renewed or whatever. I mean, you notice that it's very hard to get it done in the summertime,
Mhm.
like those months, like around like July, August. It's kind of everything slows down. It's like you don't hear a response at all
They
because
like open for only like 3 or 4 hours in some bureaucratic offices in Europe, like 3, 4 hours max,
that's right. That's right.
nine
Yeah,
to nine to noon, and plus they have an hour lunch, so you really only have 2.5 hours. That used
something
to
like that.
happen.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, I went to a German office, and it would be, yeah, we're only open today from 10 to noon. It's like, okay.
yeah. So
And
you just
we're used to 8 to 5 at least, or 9 to 5. But some state offices, I'm starting to notice they're sort of going to this 8 to 3, at least here in the state of Texas, 8 to 3 kind of pattern. But in Germany, I always remember they had really, really short time frames, and it was just ridiculous. You could never really get to them. I
that's
think
right.
they
Yeah.
they did it on purpose,
And
so
it would
nobody.
be during the regular times of the year, and then of course in the summertime, everything's gums up even more, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
um,
yeah. So it's
yeah, so
definitely different.
vacation time is more important over there.
Yeah.
Um, and
Would you say it's fair to say that in Europe there's a kind of acceptance for a slow working culture as compared to a high fast-paced working culture that wants high output performance by cashiers or workers. And I always had this view, maybe I'm wrong, but every time I traveled to Europe, I got this idea that there's a tolerance for a slow pace work pattern. I mean, you go to a grocery store, they have all chairs are sitting there, and they're kind of, they don't work fast. They're just working kind of in a routine that I never see in the US. US, everything, fast paced, and even in the cashiers at a gas station, they really,
it's very
maybe
funny
it's just,
because I had this one
yeah.
American friend, and he pointed out to me
Mhm.
when he's going to the Aldi's. We have a
Uh,
lot of Aldi stores around here
yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
says, "Oh,
They're
it's
fast.
very European
Uh,
because they allow their employees to sit,
yeah.
right?"
Yeah.
Now, but then the thing is that the Aldi cashiers, they're very, very quick,
Yeah.
They're much
Yeah.
quicker than the cashiers who are standing at, the other grocery stores.
Yeah.
So which means that I think they have a much higher pressure to be quick, to scan
Oh
the
yeah, yeah,
items
yeah.
quickly. So even though, I
Yeah,
mean, it looks more leisurely because they're sitting down, but they're moving much quicker. And plus, because nowadays Aldi has the self-checkout things too, right?
yeah, they do. Yeah, that's true.
And and if, let's say, as a customer, if you screw up something on the self-checkout, or let's say an item doesn't scan at all, then basically you have to yell across the
Ye-
room to
Yeah.
the cashier, who at the same time is checking out other customers, right?
Yeah, they do the refund too right there.
That's
So,
right. And so and
yeah,
then they have to push, like, the cashier has to push the buttons on the secondary screen. So there's a primary screen with the customers that they're handling right now, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
then
yeah.
there's a secondary screen for the self checkouts, right? So they
Yeah.
have to change something on the self checkout while they're checking out that customer right in front of them, right?
Yeah.
So they're
They-
basically multitasking, right?
yeah, I think Aldi uses the lean production idea, in Japanese Toyota idea of limited workers, put more work on the workers. That's why they only have like 3 or 4 cashiers, maybe even less. It's lean production idea. Uh, that's also true in Germany. I mean, you go to a German Aldi, you only have like two or three people, and there's another thing that because of the small workforce that they have, they often get around these worker council laws that exist in Germany. So you know that every employer, if they have at least, I think, 40 people, they have to have a worker council. And because it's so small, they get around that a lot. Bigger companies like BMW or Volkswagen, they have to have a worker council, which means trade union, representation. So that's often seen as the Aldi's trick, to get around this. At least in Germany, that you have requirements for a worker council representation. And as a ratio, they have like, I think if they have, like I said, 40 workers, they have to have something like 10 members in a worker council that people are voted in to represent the workers, right? Unlike the US, there's very little union representation, I think,
Yeah,
of any
even at the
Aldi
other
store.
supermarkets, right? You probably don't have
Yeah, there are
much.
some, attempts to unionize, at least automotive industry, but I've never seen there's some attempts, even Costco. I think in Canada there was an attempt, but very few retailers in the U.S. are unionized. You know, Surprisingly, though, the NFL players are in a union. I didn't know that until some student told me. Uh,
Yeah, I saw
and
like
police,
Starbucks, right? I mean, they were trying
yeah,
to do that.
Amazon, that's in the news right now.
Amazon,
Amazon,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, and some postal workers are, but
And
definitely more union density is a lot larger percentage of in Europe. That you notice that when you travel there, the air railway workers strike, then the bus drivers strike, then the teachers strike, right? Then
oh, there's in Germany and in France for sure. Yeah.
yeah, medical students strike, the doctors strike, and
In Austria, the strikes are still rarer, right?
oh,
They do
really?
happen, but not as
Okay,
often. They have this like social partnership regime, right?
okay.
Between,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a cooperation between employers and the unions in the state, right?
Now, in Austria, do they also have something like Kündigungsschutz, firing protection? Like there's a process where you can't just
Yeah,
fire a worker and you have to like vote
yeah,
on it.
yeah.
You have
That's
to
right.
make a case. Yeah, that's something
Yeah.
else. That's different. Hire and fire is kind of the norm in the US. Hire and fire. There really isn't you could appeal it, I guess, legally, but usually you can't. But in Europe, you have this firing protection and you have yeah, all sorts of yeah regulation regarding that. Worker representation laws, things like that. Yeah, they even have labor courts, labor courts, labor law, which is a separate legal system besides the criminal legal system or the civil legal system. Then you got a labor courts over there. So. We don't really have that. You only have something like the National, what is it, Relations Board,
Yeah.
uh, but
And
we
then that
don't.
NLRB, the National Labor Relations
Yeah,
Board,
yeah, federal kind
it
of.
changes every cycle, right? So every political cycle or so. Right
Yeah,
now, I mean, with Trump getting in, I mean, you can be assured that,
yeah,
he's
it's
going to appoint like pro-business
yeah,
lawyers into those, labor
division.
boards.
Yeah.
And it'll be very hard to organize any union activity. I've noticed it myself when I was a
Mm-hmm.
graduate student, right? I mean, it went from like, let's get it done, right, at the end of the Obama administration,
Mm-hmm.
and then switched over to Trump, and everybody was getting very depressed about it. And of course, the union administration was very happy about it because they didn't have to deal with
Yeah,
this for a long time, right?
yeah, it's a big topic. I mean, that's I think in your quality of life indicators. I think just a little soft criticism. I think you went a little soft with the work and labor. I mean, that could have expanded into issues like, union density, uh, like that. There's a lot of statistics on that. I mean, there's a lot of available data on that.
Yeah, that's for
Uh,
sure. Yeah, it was
yeah,
it was something I thought
what?
about very quickly,
Yeah,
and I didn't think about. I mean, I always thought about like the macro picture about the labor hours and the
yeah,
vacation time.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I mean, said that, but you know, union rights, union density. I think it's an important part of
Mm,
quality of life. Where you could say that if you only look at the quality of life of the executives and the bosses, it's a very restrictive measure, right? Because I mean,
mm.
for the average person, the union has a much bigger impact, right? Um, because like the presence of a union also increases the wages for non-union workers too, right?
Oh yeah.
Because the non-union workers, they could always say to the bosses, "Hey, I can go apply for a job with the union place," right?
Hmm.
So eventually, the non-union employers eventually have to raise wages too, right? So
Yeah.
that has an impact.
Which
Um,
is one more thing. You know what might be interesting is to bring in the right to work laws regime. You might say a right to work regime and comparison to European labor laws. That those are different can of worms. The right to work kind of gives more power to employers and their vested interests. And in the European setting, it's more on the side of workers. There's a more of a you could take it to a labor court. You could strike. You could, without severe consequences. And I think a culture that's sees work as more tied to political action too. That's why you sometimes see the students striking together with labor. In the U.S., you have this right to work regime. That's a kind of very restrictive of what unions can do, how they can finance, how they can kick people out that are free riders and they just want to get the benefits of the union but don't want to pay union fees. So that's a different kind of system. You have a right to work regime more on the side of employers, and then in the European setting, you have a kind of pro-worker friendly regime for the most part. You know, for the most part, right? So that's the
yeah,
way I
so
would
so
describe the
there's
difference.
this progressive commentator Tom
Uh,
Hartman, and he always
uh,
calls it, the
uh,
right to work for less laws, right, instead of
yeah,
right to work law, because because it is true, like the label right to work
yeah,
is a
deceptive.
little
Yeah,
bit misleading, right? So right to
yeah,
work for me means that it's like a full employment guarantee, like a job guarantee, right?
yeah,
Like, okay, I cannot find a job, let me go to the government, they give me a job, right?
yeah.
But your right to work laws means that so I cannot have a closed shop, right? So I cannot
Exactly.
force
You can't
uh,
force
an employee
so
to join a union
or pay a union fee.
or to pay the union dues.
So basically, you don't have any other way to sanction or punish free riders. And free riders free ride off of the union workers. But the union workers that are willing to go on a picket line, they're doing all the work and they're putting their energy into maintaining a union. And then you have free riders. Those are people that are not part of the union. They may even be strike breakers. They may even be, sabotaging union interests, and then they get legally protected under US law. So it's kind of odd because you have basically you can then be a non-union member and still get union benefits, even though you're sabotaging the union workplace. And there's no way for them to sanction it. Like the courts always go with the right to work law. And like, well, they can't be punished. They can't force them to pay union fees, which is ironic because if you think about uh, country clubs, golf country clubs, if you don't pay your union fee, I mean, you don't pay your country club fee, they can kick you out, right? You know what I mean? Like you go to a golf country club and
That's right. Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to play golf here. I don't want to pay the fee though. I'm a free rider, they can kick you out of the club. You have to pay your golf fee, to be in the country club. But when it comes to work, it's a different rules, like if you're not a union member, you can still get the benefit of being a non of union place, but you can't be forced to pay a fee, or union due or something like that.
Yeah, because
Again,
ultimately, I mean,
mm,
they create the laws to
yeah, vested
benefit the
interest.
capitalist class, right? I
Yeah, it's
mean,
vested interests. It's another way to think about it. So, yeah, very good topic, by the way.
and any
We could
employers, they have more
power.
power. I mean, they have more influence. I mean, right
Yeah.
now, I would say that um, the separation between the state and the corporate sector. I mean, there never was a real separation.
Mm,
But right now, I mean, it becomes even more obvious that there isn't any, right? Like, if you
yeah.
look at the fiasco with the government budget, right?
Oh,
Recently,
yeah, yeah.
where they were saying we're going to pass. Well, there were two bills. There was a Democratic bill, right,
Mhm,
which Elon Musk was arguing against on the social media, right? And so then, and he was threatening all of the Republican Congress members to primary them if they vote for the Democratic bill, right?
mhm.
So they voted
And
it
he's
down.
unelected, if you think about it, he's not elected. He's unelected.
Yeah, he's not elected, right?
Yeah, so
And then and
that
then
I
and
think
then
it's that opens up a can of worms. People that are not elected within the democratic system process still have so much power.
that's right.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's, sounds
He's
like feudalistic almost, know, you know,
yeah.
uh,
It,
neo-feudalism or something. Go
it's
ahead.
like you have like an oligarch, and now it's like completely shameless, right? So because then you
Uh,
like a classic way how the billionaires are controlling politics is they would contribute to these like super PACs or
mm,
some kind of like financial organization, right? And also lobbyists, right? So they would always hire like intermediaries, right?
mm,
And the intermediaries are the ones that are interfacing with the politicians. And of course, the politicians, they need the money from these rich people to run their campaigns, right?
yeah, yeah, that's
Um,
a good way
eh,
to put
eh,
it. Yeah.
yeah, so but it was kind of like a very hidden way of doing it, right? But now it's kind of like out in the open, right? I mean, now it's like, you know,
Mm,
Musk is just trying to show off. It's like,
yeah,
I'm in charge. I'm running the government, right?
yeah.
And then Trump, I mean, he was adding his tweets after Musk tweeted his post, right? He's kind of like reactive in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Um and yeah, so I mean, it's just like, well, I mean, you can say whatever you want about Trump. I mean, he's a billionaire himself, but at least he's elected, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he's the guy that was put on top of the ticket. Um, but now it's just like the guy behind him, right? The oligarch behind him who dumped $250 million into his campaign,
Mm.
is the one that is calling the shots with the government decisions.
Which is
Um,
crazy, when you think about it. Yeah.
yeah,
Crazy, crazy.
this is the oligarch system, but I mean, it's kind of like
Yeah.
sooner or later you'll get to that point. Um, if you read the Thomas Piketty, right, this argument about like
Oh,
why
yeah,
is
that one.
inequality growing over time, right?
French
Capital owners are making
economist.
more and
Yeah.
more money, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
he notices a trend of, that it's increasingly unequal financially also, this growth of inequality. Didn't he do like tax records that go way back 200 years and he noticed this deep
yeah, that's
divide?
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and then
yeah.
it's very simple observation. I mean, like anytime you have like the rental rate, right? So the rental rate is like the average of all of the, rental returns from real estate and stocks, right, in companies.
Mhm.
So or any kind of like income producing asset, right?
Acid. Yeah.
And then those assets they produce more returns than the return of the general economy, right? So say the
Hmm.
general economy grows to 2 or 3%, and then the rental rate is about 6%, right? So every year you're gonna have more returns on the rents than on the
And on,
entire economy.
wow.
And we are the commoners. We depend on the growth of the general economy
Yeah.
because it's the general economy that decides how much money is being invested in the economy, and then out of those investments, we basically uh, get our jobs, right?
Hmm.
And our raises. Um, so yeah, so if you get a W-2, if you get a wage, income, then or if you're like a small business owner, then you depend on the growth of the general economy. And for the very wealthy,
Assets.
yeah, it's about the assets. And the assets always grow faster than the economy, right?
Yeah. And it's also the dividends and everything that
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
financial sector. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. So over
Yeah.
the long term, the rich are going to get richer. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just like if you run it over many years, the 6% is going to accumulate, much higher than the 2%, right?
It's a cumulative advantage over time
That's right.
because of the assets that grow. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And with Musk, I mean, it's interesting. Before the election, he was at 300 billion. Now
Yeah.
he's at more than 400 billion. I think it's like 447 billion or something, right?
Yeah.
It's astronomical sums of money. Um, and yeah,
It's
of course, I mean, of course, so these are not like it's not cash in his bank account, right?
yeah.
Most of it, it's not cash in his bank account, like for most of us. But it is like the valuation of his stocks, right? The stocks of his companies. And all of the investors know that his companies are doing better than they ever have because Trump just won the election, right?
Mhm.
And so, of course, he was going to get the government contracts. Um, so you can already see the conflict of interest is built in, right?
Yeah. It's totally
Um,
connected. Yeah.
where he's like the Doge, his government department, is going to cut the social programs, so that's the preferred things that they want to cut. I don't think they're going to succeed, but they'll
Yeah.
try.
Yeah.
And of course, the subsidies that go to his companies is going to increase, right? Um,
Mhm.
because it's just like
It definitely fits with the phrase "the winner takes all economy." Like it's almost, but very speculative. Like it's uh, I've been reading Veblen, Thorstein Veblen. He uses the concept of vested interest. I've tried to use it a couple of times in the podcast. And vested interest, think about it like the way I understood it is you gain something for not working. You gain an additional amount of wealth, in the case of Musk, just by being in a position that you are in this position of status. And then because a political election, then people speculate on certain kinds of stocks, then it ultimately increases your wealth by not working. That has nothing to do with work. It just has to do with your vested interest and what you own at that moment that can give you a leverage, immediately. uh, which we always have this fixation on work in our society. We always use the idea of work, work. everything is based on work, right? Everything is based on merit. But we think about just owning something, and then you maintain ownership over it. You can just by political faith, that there's a change of political administrations or a political election outcome, that it changes your wealth situation immediately. Like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, however long that's going to take, and that's not based on work. It's kind of like gambling, or I mean, I don't know what you would call it. It's almost like making predictions about, you go to Las Vegas and you think, I'm gonna go bet on this horse versus that horse, and you're just betting, and then you take your money at that point, and you can increase your income if you bet right, if you bet correctly, or you can lose it all, right? I mean, but that's what's interesting. A lot of things are increasingly not based on work. They're things that are based on people's status or ownership over certain, things that they have acquired. Uh, that it's independent of work. It's just like it happens that you're in that position, and then you just get more, of it. I don't know. I'm kind of working at it. I'm kind of working at this
Yeah,
theoretically. It's kind of interesting because people often criticize us like UBI. These people don't want to work, and it's unconditional income. How dare you propose unconditional income? Like, well, how does that work with shareholders and dividends? You're just a shareholder and you get a dividend payout. There's nothing related to work there. You just happen to be owner of a share. But the dividend is a kind of residual basic income. I mean, it's not related to work. It's just related to, you own a share, or you have many shares, Costco share or a McDonald's share or Nike, share. Does that make sense? I mean, we never look at it that way, but that's extracting income through just owning it. Just like land. I mean, land is something that someone can own and could sit on it for 10 years, and then it automatically increases the value. I don't know how much land could be worth more in certain areas in the US. You could just own it and then you sell it like in 10 years, and then you get 200% more or something.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. So,
I don't know. I'm just thinking it through. I'm more like an
but
economist now.
that's the whole point of like the capitalist economy, right? So if you're,
Yeah.
yeah, the ownership class, they'll be rich, and then the working class will be poor, and
Yeah.
it's kind of the perennial antagonism. And and of course, if the workers weren't poor, then the rich, the ownership class wouldn't be rich, right? Because
Hmm. Hmm.
because then in that case, I mean, it would be like communism, right? I mean, the ownership class would be forced to basically, share the dividends with the masses.
Yeah.
Um, and that's why I mean, like, if you look at the AI discussion right now, I mean, I just saw recently, OpenAI 3, right, which is the current model,
Hmm.
um, apparently has a higher prediction accuracy than what humans would be able to do.
Oh,
And
wow.
so the argument is that we have already reached AGI, right? General intelligence, which means that that in terms of the reasoning functions, the AI is already surpassing most human beings.
Wow.
And then having to do with so much computing capacity being used to improve these algorithms.
Hmm.
Um, and in social media, I mean, you start seeing a lot of like trepidation, especially among the software engineers, the people that are working on the inside, the ones that are developing these algorithms, are saying that, oh, we're not going to be able to find any jobs anymore, and we need to have UBI right away. Um, versus I think in the general economy, I think people don't talk about it as much now, um, because well, I mean, well, it means two things. I mean, either the technology is not ripe, um, or it is ripe, but it hasn't been deployed yet, right?
Yeah.
Um, Uh,
definitely.
and it's probably, I think it hasn't been deployed at this point. I mean, because the capitalists themselves, right? They're kind of like giddily awaiting the potential of AI, to basically do labor cost savings and stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but but, I mean, beyond case studies, I mean, we haven't seen it being rolled out on the wide scale.
Oh yeah, yeah. I
Um,
can imagine banks and like even academic institutions, they start seeing it more and more, commercial art, music industry, movie industry. We already sort of seen AI art, AI, writing assistants, everything. I mean, it's creative industries. It's just massive. I mean, we're going to see it in front of, in our lives. So,
yeah, I mean, it gets to
uh,
the point where it's like you don't know what's real and what's not, right? I mean, so right now,
yeah.
I mean, you know, of course, when we put this podcast out, I mean, we will say, we're real people, we're two
Yeah.
humans that are
Yeah,
still
talking.
chatting with each other, right? Um,
Yeah.
but nowadays, I mean, you have these like, AI podcasting services now where basically what it is you can take, let's say, you can produce these educational podcasts, right? So let's say you have a particular topic, right? Um, and you have, let's say, lecture slides, and then you just upload all of the content,
Hmm.
and then it will produce two fictitious people
Oh, really?
who will then have a conversation about the topic, right?
Wow,
Uh,
that's
and,
crazy.
and also like, and they're going to use these like inflections of like, okay, like halfway through, like let's crack that joke, right, or something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah. Make it
Um,
more human realistic,
yeah, make it more human, make it more
authentic. Yeah.
relatable, yeah, things like that. So yeah, and then that's the thing, right? So I mean, if you're Joe Rogan, you're at the top of the podcasting heap. You probably, you're probably okay with what's happening there, because you already made all of your money and you have a brand name,
Hmm.
and people are, looking for your content, right? Um, but for anybody who was thinking that they could make a living off of the podcasting, right? I mean, which I mean
Yeah.
doesn't apply to in my case or some other people's cases. But for some people who are like on the cusp, where they were like, okay, I want to live off of the podcast. I think they're definitely in trouble, right? If
Oh, yeah.
doing this AI podcasting, and um, and that's why I mean, so hypothetically, so if AI is able to do everything that we're doing, right?
Hmm.
Does it mean that we should never get out of bed? We should just get stuck in bed and just watch Netflix and make ourselves stupid and irrelevant. Um,
It
no, I
it
mean,
it definitely. Go ahead, Larry. I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead. I,
it gets us back to the point of leisure society. I think,
uh,
if we want to make a normative case for leisure society, number one, we need to have a universal basic income, right, where everybody has the insurance coverage, right, more or less. Can never starve to death, right? Can live a pretty good life. And number two, will then will then have to teach people to entertain themselves,
mm,
and not think about this economic productivism, right?
mhm.
But go ahead. Yeah, I was interrupting your train of thought.
Uh, uh, I'm sort of thinking it through a little bit. Like there's kind of AI opens up, some utopian scenarios. Let's call it future scenarios where work will fundamentally be altered, will be increasingly put into question. What counts as work, what doesn't count as work, what counts as compensated work, what counts as uncompensated work. So I'm kind of like thinking there's utopian scenarios, some of which can have unintended consequences, even for labor unions or how the future is going to look like. Ultimately, we will have to manage AI technology. I think as institutions, as members of society, as people, the political institutions, we'll have to manage AI technology and what direction it's going to go. And it should not be monetary interests that manage that. If it is, then yeah, that could be a dystopian scenario, like if you ever watch, RoboCop or what's the other one, The Terminator, or other futuristic dystopian sci-fi films. That's a dystopian likely future scenario. But I think there's a lot of people that have this utopian future scenarios where they're optimistic about AI. They think it could, like you said, it could bring forward the leisure society much quicker and remove us from this intensive work fixation society, I guess you could call it. It would have to rewrite what is meant by work. Now, one example I'm going to think about right now, that is already kind of, I think, more and more people are questioning when it comes to sports and esports. You know, um, we still have professional sports. We got professional teams, and there's real physical people that are performing in sports. In the U.S., we know that it's a big, big business. NFL, NBA, WNBA, NHL, soccer, even. And these are real physical people, real physical bodies that, and often with medical injuries later in their lifetime. But now there's esports. Esports, even in some colleges where I work, there's even esports scholarships. And there's the possibility that you could have, like computer game kind of warfare. I don't know if we would call it that. But is it the same kind of work or an activity that we think of as sport, the physical sport? And should be compensated the same way? If you have an E kind of athlete, that's behind a computer screen playing World of Warcraft or whatever, should that person be compensated the same way as a person that's really in a physical training and has to prepare and has to train? Uh, that's what I think AI will ultimately rewrite boundaries, and it will probably start to put in question, who decides what gets how much compensation for what they do. And with sports, that's where it gets interesting because it may actually have a positive outcome where some of the more physical injuries and catastrophes that we have because males are in like boxing or even NASCAR racing, or what was it, real physical damage, that we could phase that out, and then we could just, related through esports, and then you can put it on a screen. You can still have a team that's an esport team, but it wouldn't have the same physical damage, you know.
So
That a,
esports is basically like a computer game, effectively.
Esports is actually now in college institutions will have programs that support esports teams. So they either play, shooter games, or they play real games, whether console games or advanced computer games, and they're competing against other colleges and other teams. Um, so that's a possibility. They're incorporating it now to where it's a real thing. It's treated as professional, and you can get a degree, you can get a major in it. You're treated like a real athlete. You're seen as a real athlete. But all of this is synthetic. All of this is a computer
But
generated
but but but
using
you, but
using.
you don't have like an athletic body, right? I mean, you
No, you
because you
would. It would be it's getting very close. You get an athletic, you can get a esports. They are real considered e-athletes. They are, behind a computer screen, but they have skills that are just related to playing the game, and they're simulating
well,
these
it's a
games.
mental stamina. It's not physical, right? It's
Right.
like,
It is like these like tournaments you would often see. They used to have just promoted by the video game industry, the top players that would get awards. They become very famous. We see this like in South Korea and Japan. It goes at another level. I mean, it's like they're like celebrities. And they all they do is they play these games and they get, royalties. They get some uh, benefit, but they're engaging in video game play simulating sports, right? Or even simulating warfare, or where they pay them a real income source. So what am I getting at here? I'm getting at that AI has that possibility that it will really put a wedge into some of these uh, institutions where, even high risk kind of sports, like I said, boxing or football, like where there's a lot of physical damage, a lot of wear and tear of athletes, and they get, brain problems or, concussions. That can easily transition over into some esports event where then you have still a simulation of the game, but it would be kind of like a video game play, but it's uh, and they would maybe not get compensated as much at the beginning, but I could see it, yeah, transition over. Or maybe they don't have the physical football like we have now. Maybe just less contact sport. Even NASCAR racing is kind of high risk. It's a high risk sport. They can open up a variety of scenarios. Um, Training of workers in these simulations. You could probably use it as training work. They already had those simulators where you can ride a truck. That's a truck simulator. You can all do all sorts of things. That again, it would challenge the whole nature of work, and then it could phase out certain kind of high risk jobs, or it could move them away, protect certain workers from high risk professions. It's just an idea. I mean, I could see AI kind of being the forerunner, and again, with the entire computer industry too, though. I mean, it could probably open up more and more, uh, job sectors, even
well, I mean, the whole
you
idea
know,
of like,
drone
getting rid,
operators. Go ahead.
I mean, the whole idea of getting rid of actual sports, like physical sports, I think
Uh,
is
high,
probably,
high, high risk sports, like think of like I
yeah.
said, football. You don't think it could happen? It
Well,
would
I mean,
scare.
I personally think it's not a good idea because
Okay.
I think there's something about human evolution where,
Uh,
you know, we were, we have evolved as a physical species, and then we invented those very physical contact sports, in order to basically show off, our strength. Maybe I guess, for many men it was supposed to be about impressing women, right? Impressing
right.
potential mates. It might be the original motivation, but later on, it kind of becomes like a professional career where you can earn income, right?
Hmm.
And and I actually, I mean, for me in a leisure society, I mean, like continuing to do physical sports, um, is actually one of the desirable things to keep, right?
Hmm.
Like even if an AI could do it better, right? The
Hmm.
whole point of leisure society is not, as I argued in the leisure society essay, is not to be better than AI, but to find an activity that fills your time and you enjoy doing it, right? Um, so
Here's the question that I have is, what's the boundary distinction between work, recreation, and maybe we get attached recreation to leisure? What exactly will be the defining deterministic kind of difference between work, paid work, leisure, recreation? I mean, what exactly will, like in the future scenario,
what
if it's possible, like what would be the defining criteria
well, to
that
separate
something
it.
is, yeah, like what would be the defining criteria when some
Well,
people say, you go ahead.
I
Yeah.
thought, I mean, the objective is to merge those domains, and the way how you merge those domains
Yeah.
is through UBI, right? Because I mean, because right now, I mean,
Hmm.
people think in a bifurcated way, right? It's like I do X for my job and I do Y for my leisure time. Um, and they have to think in those separated ways because the leisure time does not produce the income, but the work does produce the income that they need to live, right?
Hmm.
If you supply, like, say, a basic set of goods, right, and services and an income, um, then you can blur those boundaries. I mean, like, think of somebody who, you know, is like a full-time YouTuber, right?
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
right now? I mean, like, there's a small number of like full-time YouTubers, people who are cracked the number of views to, get a significant amount of advertising money, right? Um, that's a very small number of people, right?
Hmm.
Um, and
Small
also,
number.
those YouTubers, I mean, notice they're very beholden to the company, to Google, right, to YouTube,
Definitely. Yeah.
because if you say the wrong thing, they just demonetize you, right? They don't have to justify.
Cancel culture.
Uh,
Cancel
yeah, they
or
don't have to justify the
can
demonetization.
yeah, cancel
Um,
industry. Yeah.
yeah, it's basically cancellation because you said something that was like politically incorrect, right? Basically.
Yeah.
um and you're really trapped, right? I mean, I took this course in political philosophy under
Mhm.
Philip Pettit. He defined the concept of civic republicanism.
Okay.
And his idea of civic republicanism is the basic idea that um it is driven by the non-domination principle, right? So people can look each other in the eye without fear, right? Without fearing the other person, right? Right
Like
now,
an
I mean,
equal
with a YouTube
equality kind of.
example, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, right now I'm very fearful because I could be demonetized and I could stop making money from the platform.
Hmm.
Um, you know, if I say a basic income is non-cancelable, right? Regardless of like how inconvenient your political views are, right? I cannot cancel your UBI because that's your human right, right?
Hmm.
Um, you know, then I think it would just produce, you know, well, I don't know whether it will produce better content, but it will definitely produce freer content, right? It'll be an actual expression of what people really believe in. And
And then they
uh,
have more autonomy over what they decide to do with their time without the constant threat of worrying that they need the basic, some basic income source. And UBI is that primary guarantee, that you can't lose this basic income, source. Uh,
no, that's
yeah,
right. Yeah,
general
yeah. It's
idea,
it's
yeah.
it's about empowerment of the
Yeah,
individual, and
autonomy,
then
yeah.
and then we can blur the boundaries between work and leisure, which for us as academics, I think it's kind of quite natural. I mean, because for us, I mean, you know,
Mm.
like doing research is kind of a leisure activity, but then it's also work because we get paid for it, right?
Right.
Um, but then the flip side of it is that you never have time off, right? You always think about your projects, and I think that this kind of like this blurring of the boundaries. This is what Marx talked about in German
Hmm.
ideology, right?
Hmm.
It is
Yeah.
about the blurring of the boundaries between labor, which is the primordial human activity in order to satisfy needs and wants, right?
Yep.
And then also creative, pleasurable pursuits, right? Like doing things that people want to do, even if it has no
Intellectual,
utilitarian purpose. Yeah.
intellectual,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, that's right. So and those are kind of the reasons why we needed to have basic income, right?
Yeah. Basic income guarantee. Yeah.
Uh,
One
Education.
more.
So
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
run through the last two. I think it was very
Edu
quickly. Um,
you got education there, yeah.
Education. you could say that the US has very, high um like rates of education, right? I mean, we're probably, well, the upper two-thirds, well, the upper third, I would
Yeah,
say,
yeah.
in terms of the college graduation, right?
Poland is pretty good too. Oh,
Poland has got very high graduation, UK, Norway. These are very highly educated populations. In Austria, Germany, I mean, you notice that they have a different emphasis, right? They have like
vocational, right?
the vocational track, right? Which
Hmm.
is, very big. So you don't really have to go to have a college education as much. Um, and yeah, so you could say that, well, because we have like the top universities, right? We should be having, the highest quality of life, right? Because of the great education that we have, right? I mean, we have a lot of money, a lot of research dollars that go into these top universities. And I was, certainly a beneficiary of that. I attended those colleges,
Hmm.
but it's not the average experience, right? I mean, like you have a lot of like the junior colleges, the community college level, the
Yep.
mid-tier, the lower tier colleges. So there's a lot of stratification within the higher education system in a way that does not exist in the European countries, right? So in the European countries, you have like these, state universities that are oftentimes labeled after the city in which they are in, right?
Hmm.
So like University of Vienna or whatever, University of Munich and so forth, right?
Yeah.
And in that sense, I mean, they have a much more socialistic structure of like setting up their education system, right? And in that way, you can basically um, have a basic, like decent quality of education at a very low cost for most of the people. Um, yes, but you don't have Harvard, you don't have Yale, right? You don't have the top universities. Um, so yes, the US, you know, they do have, this, high innovation, economic system, right?
Hmm.
That that the more kind of socialistic orientation of the higher ed system in the European countries, they don't have that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that's true.
Now, but then what's the problem? I mean, firstly, I mean, the number of middle class positions, I mean, it's not increasing corresponding to the increase in the college degrees. So that we're back to the Randall Collins thesis,
Credentialization, right? Yeah,
the
credential.
credential inflation, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then also then the student debt burden, right, which is much higher over here than in the European countries, right? Because we have a much more capitalistic organization of a higher ed system. Um, it creates these mental strains, and lower quality of life. Anybody who has a high student debt burden, is less likely to have children, less likely to buy a house, and get set up in life, get married and stuff.
Hmm.
Um, so that's definitely a quality, lowering factor. Um, now, now with the Biden administration, I mean, what they're doing is, I think they're,
We're giving depth, right?
they're getting student debt relief, right?
Yeah.
And I would wonder, I mean, I don't know, I mean, yeah, I think under the Trump administration, the student debt burden was getting worse, right? Because, because he wants to just benefit these, these for-profit universities, right? Became unregulated, and then the students didn't get any, student debt relief, right? So we'll see how this will shake out. But yeah, but your quality of life will go down if you have a massive amount of student debt, right? Um,
Hmm.
and
Um, One more thing, and I know in Germany sometimes there's a lot of discussion on the disparities of lack of funding of education and quality of education is different in different parts. And we have this problem in the US too. Affluent districts, affluent parts of the city have better funded schools, and the the more poor income groups in another part of the city get, the don't get as much funding, or the schools are in worse shape. So quality of life, I could see very much trajectory of individuals that go through, underfunded schools, or schools that just don't get maintained, or don't have this good quality teachers. That could have an outcome, or a negative outcome, versus the affluent students getting, a better quality, teacher, maybe even better facility. Yeah, definitely something to consider. Quality. In Germany, it's discussed too, but I know in the U.S. there's always a discussion about different schools have a certain amount of money, and maybe there's a defunding of certain, or lack of keeping up with the inflation. Recruitment of teachers, making a teaching profession appealing. That's always been a problem. So yeah, those are all, I can see that being a quality of life really issue.
Yeah,
Uh,
I didn't discuss K to 12 system at all,
yeah.
but certainly, I mean, it's an important aspect of like, so I mean, as it becomes more difficult to obtain middle class positions, right? Then the kind of slotting mechanisms, right? The kind of sorting machine function, right? Which
Filtering,
is
yeah.
which is given to universities, right? Or given
Mhm,
to even K to 12, right? Like the private schools and stuff.
mhm.
Um, then become much more important, right? As a as a sorting device, more or less, right? Because you have fewer middle class positions to give out, so the few like schools at all levels, K to 12, and then the higher ed, um, they're given fewer and fewer tickets, right?
Mhm.
Um, to give out. Even though like, for the every individual like school, like their incentive is to increase the number of papers that they degrees that they mint, right?
Yeah.
Because they need more enrollment, right? Um, so in that sense, this whole credential inflation trend is it's completely natural trend, right? And it just and the thing is that I would say that education is has become part of the welfare state more or less,
Yeah.
right? Because it's supposed to solve that labor market issue, but it doesn't really solve it. It just uh yeah, it just creates like a temporary buffer more or less, right, for the labor market
So
problems.
like a parallel social safety net to the real social safety net. I think we had
Yeah,
this discussion before, educational Keynesianism, yeah. Whereas, I mean, working class parents, the fact that their kids go to the public schools, that is a reduction of cost. I mean, you think about, the electricity, the facility, the subsidized lunch. So yeah, I mean, we can make the argument that schools are somewhat like an additional social safety net, because uh, that would that cost would normally go to the parents, like even uh, just the cost of, the kids being at home versus being at the school. In the summer months in Texas, that's a big thing, because the parents may want to work during the summer, and then they don't have time to make the lunch. So some of the school districts here in Dallas, they have summer lunch programs. These are public schools, and it's a kind of additional social safety net, so the kids can kind of get a lunch, they can pick it up, and then they get a subsidized lunch, whereas normally the parents, would be making it, that would go out of their pocket. So yeah, we can make the argument that public schools are kind of an additional, yeah, social safety net. I mean, it's like to the benefit of parents, and the community, because a lot of jobs come from school districts, the staff they hire, the school bus drivers, right? The construction that's required. So It's also beneficial for the local communities. Mostly, a lot of times, this is the biggest employer. In some Texas cities, the school districts are the biggest employers, besides Walmart. You know, the case with Dallas ISD, I think they are a major employer of all the staff and teachers. You know, big impact on their local economy.
Yeah, and
That's a
so basically, I mean, the U.S. welfare state, because it is so poor in a lot of areas, then like the education system takes an outsized role because ultimately, I think like this whole idea of like, why are people against welfare? Well, because they're against, giving lazy people something for nothing, right? That's sort of the always the argument. And in like in education, I mean, that moral argument is very tough to make, right? Because school kids, they're not responsible for being lazy. I mean, they're supposed to have the opportunity to learn, right?
Mm,
Um, Unlike adults, and then the other argument is about the self-improvement idea, right? Is like the idea is like if you enroll in a course, right? You're supposed to better yourself, and you're going to make yourself more competitive in the marketplace, right? So you can
right.
actually be a better contributor to society. So therefore, I mean, this is one of the areas where the political left and the right can agree on it, right? Where it's like it's an acceptable form of welfare expenditure.
Mhm.
Um, and so then oftentimes, yeah, then the national resources go in
Yeah.
that direction.
That's the
Um,
case. Yeah, go ahead. That's the case in Texas. Rural districts, which are very conservative, have gone with the public school path, often rejecting this whole idea of charter schools, private schools. Uh, and so that's a unique situation. You would normally think that a rural school would be more conservative and they are anti-public school. But the reverse has happened, at least in Texas. There's a great resistance from rural school districts because they're fearful that they would lose a big chunk of their already limited budget and that they would lose employment opportunities and it would be a kind of two-way system. Like little small rural districts would have three schools and they would all divide up the public budget between three different schools instead of just having one school that's a public school receiving for that rural area that one, a lump sum of money from the state.
and it's
Uh,
always the big city schools that have like the disputes with the teachers' unions, right? Like
yeah,
the
yeah.
Chicago public school, I mean, is probably very notorious for that, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's more politicized, I think, in urban areas, but like that's what makes it interesting in rural areas that are really dependent on school districts as a revenue source because you're talking about a lot of the rural areas, that's the biggest employer. I mean, the teachers, the school bus drivers, that's a big amount of money. And so those air communities rely on that as an income source from the state. And so when people go after that and they want to try to split it up into maybe charter school option, then the worry is it would split the budget and there would be nothing to go around, it'd be kind of breaking that revenue source. So that's a unique topic to get into too. This is just something I've seen in the South. I don't know about Northeast United States. I don't know exactly how that is, situated.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm
I'm,
not an education scholar, so I have
I'm
not
not
followed up on
me neither.
this
But it's
issue.
something I read in the newspapers. Even the school buses, that is a big money issue. The school buses and big contracts to renew school buses, the equipment that schools use, lots of money is in there. So that's also a revenue source for some businesses. Maintenance of schools. All right, so that's another topic. Oh, we're
Yeah, I
uh,
mean, for me, it's like the idea of like should we have like colleges as like the social safety net. I think should we have like in the K to 12 system, should we have the school districts as a social safety net, like, does it improve our quality of life? I put a question mark on it, and I asserted that, like, the education system should be designed for the nerds, people who actually enjoy studying.
Yeah,
And I know this is not a very popular view, because I mean, obviously, from the administrator viewpoint, you're like, well, okay, I want to enroll as many people as I can, right? As a way of
right, right,
earning
right.
income. Um, yeah, and
Well,
then I
yeah,
think the
religion.
last point I mentioned is
Uh-huh.
religion.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um,
Durkheim,
so
yeah.
that's one of
Yeah.
the areas where you might say, well, actually, the U.S. is one that does a lot better. So I mean, if you assume that, like, um that religious belonging, right? Like this
Hmm.
Durkheimian argument, right? Like the
Hmm.
rituals, the solidarity,
Yeah.
yeah, everybody's together, collective
If
effervescence, right?
yeah.
Then you say, well, the more religious people are doing better, but then the wealthier you get, right? Definitely, all of the European countries are um, very secular, right?
Yeah.
European countries are very secular, and then among the rich countries, only the U.S. is really quite religious.
Where's Poland? Is Poland in it? No, I don't see Poland. There's
Um,
no, no, I don't see. That's okay. I'm
yeah, they
curious.
probably are not in here. Well, you see Hungary here,
There's
Ukraine.
Portugal. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Just checking.
Um, yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
Poland is right. Okay, we have it here up here.
Oh, okay.
Around 20,000, and then they're about 30% religious.
Okay. Yeah. Very
Um,
good.
yeah, I mean, they have one of the more conservative, like, laws when it comes to
Yeah.
abortion rights, because
Yeah.
of the influence of the Catholic Church, but doesn't mean that the vast majority of Poles are deeply religious, right?
Uh-huh. Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's 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 so the U.S. is a much more free market orientation when it comes to, like, the churches, right? So they have, like, these mega churches, right? That are kind of attracting lots of funding. And, they you can sometimes see, like, rock concerts during, like, these church services. Um, and um, yeah, so you might say that, well, because the U.S. is more religious, that they're better off. But again, I want to make the similar argument to the education system, like with the welfare services, right? Where basically, because the state in European countries is more powerful, so they do take care of people's material needs, and then they are less likely to rely on the churches, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in the US system, because there was so much skepticism and suspicion about the government,
They have to rely on religious institutions.
they
Yeah.
had to rely more on religious institutions to take care of their needs.
Mhm.
And so that's why, I mean, it's a question whether on that, even on the religion indicator, whether simply the fact that the US has a very high level of religiosity means
Mhm.
that they have a higher quality of life. It puts a question mark on it, right? Because you can
Good
say that,
question. Mark.
the very secularized people that have their economic needs being met through the state, um, might have, just as high of a quality of life index as the very religious people that are living in America.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a tricky topic. Yeah, it does. Uh,
yeah, but
too many variables, because there's a rural divide, an urban divide, there's different religious sects, there's um, the Bible Belt as a region. I think it's fair to say it has higher rates of poverty. I mean, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Um, that's the most religious region of the U.S. I think it also has higher unemployment rates. Mississippi, I think, Louisiana. So that's a hard, tricky topic. That really quality of life and you know what additional measure you're trying to use. Is it like,
So you're saying that
uh,
higher religiosity could be correlated with a lower quality of life,
yeah,
not because the church attendance is lowering it, but rather people who are poor
yeah.
are more likely to have to go to church, basically. Right? Because you
Oh, yeah,
have more
like as a
needs that need to be met, right?
okay, okay, like as a substitute to state welfare assistance.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. Like
Substitute
as a
state
chair,
welfare assistance.
it's like a charity kind of, yeah, thing. Yeah,
Yeah, and also
but
the
yeah, that,
simple
yeah. Go ahead.
idea that, like, let's say if you, I mean, there's a reason why Christianity is so popular as a religion, right? Because it's basically saying, well, the rich man, will never go to heaven because they only care about money and not
Mhm.
about God. But the poor people, you guys care about God, and Jesus always likes the poor people, right? Um, and in a
Mhm.
sense, also like if you're poor, I think because you've experienced so much injustice, right? Perceived injustice,
Uh,
and then you're just like, well, at least there's a higher God, right? There's a higher force out there that is going to be on my side, right? And then
or
you're
or you could
more spiritual.
maybe think of people that are spiritual are more connected, and because they are in a community, then it reduces other kinds of risks compared to people that are not spiritual. They are, maybe high risk of not being connected. It's a kind of Durkheimian argument. Religion creates social solidarity, integration. It's a kind of mutual aid society. That could work theoretically. I mean, but what's fascinating, I mean, there's some religious sects, like the Amish, they keep to themselves. So maybe they think they are, as far as together, but economically, I mean, I don't know how much better they're off. They just are a tight-knitted community, you know. So that's what makes it interesting. Like, I mean, if really the real life situation versus the spiritual, because some of it's theological, some of it's philosophical, and also projection of life, good deeds and all that. So I don't know. It's very, but I would agree. I mean, there's probably religious people, they have more, it's a quality of life for them. There's some feeling of belonging, community principle.
Yeah, so you could say that the
And
religious people,
Gemeinschaft versus, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, they have a
Go ahead.
low quality of life to begin with, but it would be even lower if it wasn't for religion, right? So
That's a good one. Yeah, that could work.
so they need to have it, and that's why, I mean, I would say that aside from being, because religion is not just about the economics, right? I think people have value the deity, and they value the community
Mm.
life, right? As part of
Yeah.
the church community, and I definitely want to
It's
state
also
that.
a little paternalistic, there's a kind of top-down structure, and there's a little bit of moral economy also that's incorporated in religious communities. That's outside of sometimes capitalistic, thinking, different rationality of giving, doing good deeds, grace, things like this that are outside of this, just pure capitalistic thinking. Uh, but then we have to really look at the different religious sects, because they have different outlooks on, what is a good deed, or I could see that going across. I don't know. Different communities have different standards and different policies, I guess. I don't know. I'm kind of going off track now. Uh, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
like for instance, like an e-church, there's increasingly a lot of people that have the church online and everything is digital. And I'm like, is that really the same thing as going to church?
yeah. So they never get to eat lunch with the fellow congregants, right?
Right. So there's increasingly
Yeah.
like an e-church replacement to the real thing, or
Well,
but
it started with COVID, right? Because people
mm,
couldn't be in person in the same space, but
mm,
but then people stick around with it. It's almost like this hybrid working, right?
mhm.
It's like, oh, I don't have to go to the office anymore, right? So a lot of
Yeah.
office spaces are being cleared out and being sold
I ha
off, and they're going to be converted into apartment buildings.
yeah, I have
Yeah,
the
but
app. I on my Bible verses, I have the app. I can just read it on my little cell phone, or YouTube. So there's a kind of, yeah, there's a different shift, I think. Even in religious communities, there's an impact of the young, difficult in getting young people to participate. Some of the Pew Research statistics that I noticed, the younger people are more secular and the older people are far more religious. So there's a difference in generations. Somehow there's difficulty in recruiting younger people into, older religious communities, or some disconnect. It's not like 50, 40 years ago. Um, yeah, so
yeah,
yeah.
certainly. I mean,
Oh,
if
here you
you
go.
look at
Here you
the
go.
the main trend, right? The religious
Unaffiliated.
affiliation. So
Yeah.
the no religion is the one category
Going up. Yeah.
that just keeps on increasing, right? I mean, the other religions are stable, right?
Yeah.
Um, and but the Christianity is the one that's coming down. Uh,
Yeah.
so that's definitely, the major trend. I mean, the
Mhm.
secularization of the society, and to that extent, you can say that even if you accept the argument that because the Americans are more religious than the Europeans, that the American quality of life is higher on the spiritual front, right? If
Mhm.
you accepted that statement, then the secularization of society, what we see in this graph,
Would be a negative, right?
yeah, I mean, would
Or
then
something
be
like
would then be a
negative.
negative, right? It would reduce the amount of solidarity
Mm.
that prevails, in society. Um,
What
yeah, I mean,
One more thing I thought about, a fragmented religious community, is increasingly like maybe tensions between different views of cultural war topics, and people get very divisive, and a fragmented religious kind of communities that are not, they are fighting against each other more than they are working together. That's what I'm getting at. I could see that be a consequential, uh, where there's tensions over certain issues that people, certain groups cannot agree on it, and so there's a divisiveness even between religious, organizations or groups on LGBTQ issues, on, politics in religion, on Trump. I mean, there's sometimes real conflict even within religious communities. For instance, let me give you one example. In here in Dallas, Fort Worth, one of the suburbs, the Church of Latter-day Saints wanted to build a giant like church uh, in a community suburb. It was going to be like a temple, I think, and most of the individuals rejected the temple, and uh, be, it was, I think most of them were Protestant, but they were not Church of Latter-day Saint. So sometimes there's even tensions between different religious groups, that they don't want to have the building built, or maybe there's anti views, and there's conflict sometimes that's created over groups battling over, space in the city or something. So that actually happened in suburb. I'm trying to remember the name of the city, but there was like a conflict over the building being built, and people were upset that it was going to be built. So the zoning got involved. I think they ended up making an agreement, but it was something that they got, people were frustrated that why are they building this here, or something like that. So yeah,
yeah, conflicts happen all the time. I mean,
yeah,
I was watching the movie recently
uh,
by Conclave,
okay. Oh,
which is
that was a good one. The
yeah, it
Pope.
was
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
it was
yeah.
the
I saw that
election
one.
of the Pope, right? It's a fictitious story from I think Robert Harris is a British novelist. But yeah, I mean, the main premise is simply that, you know, the churchmen are men, right? Basically,
Mm.
they're lusty, they're greedy, right?
Power there.
They're
Yeah,
power hungry, right?
yeah.
And then the other thing is that, there's, if you have like very strict moral standards, um, then you're gonna get into a dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Because like, for instance, like that stipulation that the Pope has to be a man, right?
Hmm.
That creates a moral dilemma because what do you do with somebody, who was born as a woman? I mean, that was, I think, um,
Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah. The end of the film. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
yeah, that's right, that's right, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a good
And,
that was a good that was a very good film, by the way. Yeah. Well, I thought it was real done. It goes through the whole process of how the whole conclave is just the process of selecting the next pope. And it's really, as far as I know, it was accurate depiction of what they actually go through. The bishop or the cardinals, they're in this area that they all have to write down the person, and then the smoke process. All that is real.
if they selected, right,
Yeah,
if they selected the
yeah,
Pope, then they put up the smoke.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I was reading, like, in the old days, the
Hmm.
conclave, they would actually starve those bishops, right? So
Hmm.
if they, okay, so I think they do 3 days, the first 3 days, like, just regular, like, nutrition, whatever, but then they reduce the rations. And then after 7 days, if they still haven't found a pope, um, then um, then the rations would be cut down to just like bread and water, right?
Oh, wow.
So basically, like, you know, what you find in these old Bible passages, right? Just eat
Mhm.
bread and water, right? Um,
Uh,
and yeah, so that should give them the incentive to figure it out, because you have like these camp formations, right?
yeah.
Um, and also, interestingly, I mean, it's not like democratic politics, right? Where it's all about the media, it's about giving speeches, right? It's about trying to do things in the public discourse, right?
Mhm.
It's more like they're standing in the hallway and then they're gossiping with each other, right? About, like,
Yeah.
okay, this guy didn't get enough votes, so we're gonna
Uh,
drop him. And we're gonna support this other candidate instead. So it's kind of like this jockeying in the hallway, right? Um,
yeah.
and that's, yeah, but I mean, I actually like that process in principle, right? Like, even though I'm not a Catholic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not having any say in it, but I find this, like, I find it principle very interesting, right? Where um because all of these bishops, I mean, they're educated men, right? I mean, they would know, like, traditional Latin, right? Um and learned men, very intellectual, and but then they have the same sort of yeah, afflictions as the other mortal humans, right?
Yeah, everybody wants to get that title of Pope. That's a master status. Once you get it, it's for life. Uh,
Yeah, that's
which
right. Yeah.
which maybe open up another can of worms. If we go back to this whole idea of what counts as work, and w being a religious clergy, in the 21st century, and prospects of employment. I mean, I don't know if I were to look at the occupational handbook by the U.S. Department of Labor, I would suspect that that profession is on the verge of extinction. But it raises the question, such a significant, task of being a member of the clergy, or, being a priest, or being significant religious kind of person that works. How do we count that as work, in the 21st century? Because I guess it's something like it's seen as significant in the community, and that value then gives it legitimacy that, yeah, that we need to treat that as work. That's labor. Someone needs to be compensated for doing that kind of work. It's important. uh, Even though, it's fewer people are attending, things like this. And so that, what I'm getting at. I don't know if you understand what I'm asking. I mean, I could see this is one of those areas where ultimately people will have to decide. that this is still valuable. Having someone that uh, reads a eulogy, or gives reads, gets people married, or serves as a public role, that has a value that's the same way as any other work occupation, and should be compensated so and so much, whatever that's uh, similar to any other position in the economy that's middle management or something, not white collar, but it could be white collar. But if you think about the Pope, I don't know how much exactly the Pope makes. It'd be kind of interesting to find out how they compensated them over, but all their
I
bills
I
were
don't
taken.
think the Pope needs to get paid, right? I mean, the Pope owns the entire Vatican, right? So basically, all of the property
Yeah,
that you see, that you find in the Vatican, and even
yeah,
possessions that they might have outside of the Vatican, right? That belong to that state,
yeah.
the
But
papal state.
But in the U.S. context, if I'm not mistaken, all of the other priests and religious clergy, they are it's like an occupation, and maybe it's a private business, or it's treated as receiving. It's like a job. I mean, it's treated as a job. So all I'm getting at here,
It is, yeah.
and the value of it, and we could see the significance of the changes in the 21st century, with work is taking a different orientation, and ultimately we as members of society, I can imagine attitudes will start to impact, is this a job, is this work? And I'm more likely people will say, yeah, it's a job, it's work, um and how much should it be compensated then, like any other profession, teachers, or
Well,
sport athletes. There's a reason why I'm going into this, because I'm trying to figure out how exactly ultimately society decides that the payment is legitimate and the compensation is legitimate, or it's not.
yeah, it's interesting.
And
So in
yeah,
Austria, the Protestant Church, right?
mhm.
They are officially protected by the state, which means that
Oh, yeah,
um, the, the,
the state church, right?
yeah,
State church.
so the state raises the
Tax.
contributions.
Is it a
Well,
state church tax?
I
Kirchensteuer?
I wouldn't call it a tax. It's a
Mm,
contribution, right? So because it goes to the members of that church community. So if you're a member of the church community, then you have to pay that contribution, right?
no. In
Uh,
Germany, as far as I know, it's kind of a basic income guarantee for members of the clergy, because it is a state religious tax that's implemented on all, with exception to if you want to get out of it. If you don't want to be part of a religious affiliation anymore, then you don't have to pay your church tax. They don't take it out of your paycheck. But that's how they legitimize the payment of and funding of churches in Germany. They take it literally out of your tax. That would never happen in the U.S. It's First
yeah,
Amendment. State
that's right.
cannot. But in Germany, it's like they force the tax unless you want to get exempted out of it, and then you're no longer a member of the religious community. Then you
Yeah,
don't have to
the
pay the.
Austrian system works like that too. It's the same way.
Which
Now,
isn't that interesting though? Because it sort of
but
figures a
then it's
way. Go ahead. Go ahead.
so
Go ahead.
my church pastor,
Uh,
right? I
uh,
mean, over there in the Protestant church, I mean, he was working a full-time job as a high school lecturer in religious studies. And I was like, okay, well, why do you have to work this job? Well, because the church contributions from the state, they're just paying for the maintenance and the upkeep of the church property,
yeah.
right? So maybe sometimes they have to hire somebody to cut the grass, right? So they have to pay that guy, or they have to pay for people to maintain the um like where they bury the dead people, like the
Yeah.
cemetery, right? To maintain the cemeteries. Um, and but they actually don't really get much money at all as a salary
Yeah.
for like the clergy. And so that's why the clergy, I mean, they work as teachers
Yeah. Yeah.
in the state schools. Um, and it also has a nice effect that you're able to reach out to young people, right? to basically get them to confirm in your church. You can basically recruit your
Mhm.
the confirmation, I think they call it, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like the people confirmed in the church.
Well, here's another question. In Austria, is religion offered as a course in a, the
In the state schools,
primary?
yes, 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 it is. It is.
That's the same thing in Germany.
And
But
you can opt out. You can opt out.
yeah, 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 yeah. You can opt out, but it's treated as a real course. I remember that too when I was a
And then the thing
kid.
is, I mean, if you opt out, I mean, I think it's not as much fun though, right? Because if you opt
Yeah,
out, then what happens is that you go to these like supervisory classes, right? Where
yeah. Supplement the time you're missing in the religion course.
yeah,
Yeah.
so there would be like a substitute teacher,
Hmm.
and then they would just tell you like do your homework or something, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So and then versus like if see if you go for the religious instruction, I mean, like you
Yeah.
actually you get to read like Bible passages, you get to debate morality, right?
Yeah.
Which sounds fun to me, right?
Yeah, yeah. One more question, because I'm curious about this, Larry. In your classroom, did they have religious symbol in the public school when you were in Austria? Did they have a religious symbols?
Yeah, yeah, they would
That
have it. Yeah,
okay, yeah. So that yeah, I
they'd
remember
put up a
seeing that when I
cross.
was a kid. Now this is way back when I was, young. So I'm just trying to remember. But that's the whole issue of state church intertwined, the state intertwines, but definitely not something you'd see in the US. Uh, unless
Yeah,
you're in the
so
Bible Belt, you're in the deep South, that maybe there's some increasing entanglement, but
yeah, so over
more in
here,
Europe.
I mean, we're saying that there is a separation of church versus state.
Mhm.
Um, but the people in the European countries are much less religious. So you have more of these, let's say, Christian symbols
Mhm.
in the school buildings and stuff, right? Um, but but people are less spiritual, right? I mean, it's just like
Yeah.
you just have an object that hangs up on the wall. I mean, for most people, it doesn't really mean that much, right?
Well, even in Germany, they were had difficulty in recruiting priests from within the country, and they would try to get priests from Africa or uh, people from other countries to become priests in Germany. There was such a demand, but there was so very few Germans that were seeking that occupation, so they were recruiting outside of Germany to hire priests or hire people to become religious clergy. I thought that was interesting, quite interesting. That proves that point, like you were saying, very secularized. It's a decline of, religiosity has declined probably since post-World War II, 60s, 1970s. But with exception, like I can see Poland still very religious, the history of Catholicism, and same thing probably with Portugal and Spain. But Scandinavia, yeah, not so much. I think the most least religious is Czech Republic. Last time I looked at the data. So yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
and it has an impact, of course, on certain policies like abortion, right? Where
Yeah,
I think
euthanasia. Yeah,
yeah the Czechs are very liberal in abortion, and then the
yeah,
Polish are very conservative.
yeah, yeah. Big divide.
Um,
Yeah,
and it all has to do with the level of like religious institutions and the power in the political process, right?
yeah, yeah.
And
Which
yeah,
prove. Go ahead.
yeah, I don't think that the conservative politicians in Poland are like that religious or that devout, but they're kind of using that, they're using the church as a kind of legitimating institution, right?
Yeah, as a vehicle. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a
to
good
get voter
topic.
support. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so yep, I think that
Conclusion. That's
yep
it,
that
huh?
that
We
wraps
did
it
it
up.
all.
Yeah, okay. Well,
That's good. All right.
okay. Well, then, thank you very much, Mike, for
No
coming
problem.
on, and
Yeah, yeah, we're good. Hey, it
yeah,
was really
we'll
good.
yep,
Good
we'll hopefully do
discussion.
this again. That's great. Yeah.